Passion has the power to consume souls, and few things in this world inflict as much pain as the shattering of illusions about a beloved person. Severing emotional bonds can be excruciatingly difficult, but delaying the process may lead to consequences far worse than a broken heart. Fate brought Maria Muñoz and Joel Pello together in their native Puerto Rico while she was studying nursing at university. Their encounter marked the beginning of a story that demonstrates just how dangerous complex love relationships can be if one fails to recognize the warning signs and take decisive action in time. Despite the fact that the man was 11 years her senior, they quickly found common ground and began building a relationship. Soon after, she moved to be with him in the United States. A few years into their marriage, the couple settled in Laredo, Texas, a city with a population of 250,000. Here, the young woman secured a position as a nurse anesthetist with a good salary. By that time, she already held a degree in the relevant field, as well as a certificate that allowed her to perform the duties of an anesthetist. Maria worked at the hospital alongside her husband. She was described as a woman who was extremely dedicated to her profession, attentive and hardworking. However, family always remained her top priority. After the birth of their children, she left her job to take on the role of a homemaker. She managed the household and raised the little ones. 31-year-old Maria Muñoz, in addition to being a caring mother, adored playing the piano. Once the children started school, she planned to continue pursuing music and renewing her nursing license. She was set to take exams to return to work at the hospital. The family's life followed its usual course, but this story would not have a happy ending. On September 22, 2020, an emergency call came through to 911. A man reported that his wife was showing no signs of life. He was clearly agitated and didn't know what to do. The distressed husband's name was Joel Pello, and the victim was Maria Muñoz. The man suggested that she might have taken some medications, leading to an overdose. At the time of the call, the woman wasn't breathing. The dispatcher advised the worried husband over the phone. He instructed him on how to provide first aid and perform artificial respiration on his wife. Joel repeated the process cycle after cycle, but to no avail. The first officer arrived at the scene within minutes. The press patrol and key events at the site of the tragedy were captured on the police officer's body camera. When he reached the doorstep, Joel opened the door very quickly. The man was wearing a blue surgical gown, which immediately caught the attention of the law enforcement officer. As soon as Joel saw the patrol officer, he hurriedly turned around and immediately headed upstairs to the second floor. The policeman followed him. Upstairs, the officer saw a woman showing no signs of life, with her husband performing artificial respiration on her. Maria was still warm at that point. Joel explained that he had already performed several cycles of cardiopulmonary resuscitation, but it had failed to revive his wife. The patrol officer also tried to provide first aid, but nothing helped. The paramedics were on their way. During the resuscitation efforts, the police officer asked the victim's husband if she could have been taking any prohibited substances. Joel denied this, but claimed that she might have taken too high a dose of prescribed medications. After that, the man went to the bathroom and retrieved a packet of pills from the home medicine cabinet. He returned to the room and handed it to the officer. It was a prescription drug commonly prescribed for treating anxiety. Joel alleged that his wife had mental health issues. Lately, she had been depressed and was being treated for depression, but she hardly used the medications. In his opinion, 31-year-old Maria ultimately couldn't cope with her problems and might have taken a lethal dose of prescription drugs to end her life. However, the experienced police officer immediately suspected something odd in the husband's words. Usually, in such cases, if a person attempts to voluntarily end their life by taking medications, the packaging is left next to the body. But neither on the bed nor in the room where the victim lay were there any syringes or pills. At the time of the police officer's arrival, the couple's 2 young children were still in their rooms, not asleep. The son and daughter had no idea that a tragedy was unfolding just on the other side of the wall. In response to the officer's questions about the children, the victim's husband said that she was a devoted mother. Alejandra and Valentina were 2.5 years old at the time. Their mother had taken them for a walk in the park the evening before the incident. Maria was in critical condition, and paramedics arrived at the scene and tried to resuscitate her along with the police officer. At that moment, the law enforcement officer recalled how he had tossed aside the packet of pills that Joel had brought. The officer did this to avoid getting distracted from helping the victim, but they were no longer there, which seemed strange. Later, upon reviewing his body camera footage, he saw Joel surreptitiously pick up the packet and hide it in his gown pocket. He was clearly trying to conceal something. When informed about this, the man reluctantly handed the pills over to the police. The detective took them to examine more closely and discovered that they indeed contained a potent prescription drug. The packet was almost full. If the woman had taken any pills, it was very few. 3 hours after the emergency call, the medics pronounced 31-year-old Maria Munoz dead. Unfortunately, they were unable to save Maria. The detectives immediately spoke with her husband, who was behaving oddly, to ascertain the circumstances of what had happened. The man said that lately, there had been problems in their relationship, and they were living separately. That evening, he had come to his wife's place to talk about their relationship, hoping to sort things out. They had a calm conversation and seemed to discuss everything. After putting the children to bed, they were intimate. Then Joel went to take a shower. After bathing, he found his wife unconscious on the bed and called for help. Law enforcement officers closely observed the victim's husband to understand if he was telling the truth. The police officer noticed that the man was sweating profusely. He was wearing only a light gown, and it seemed he was completely drenched in sweat. This appeared suspicious. Such reactions could manifest due to the use of certain substances, and this alone gave grounds to suspect he was lying, which his body language also indicated. According to Joel, Maria was a rather modest and reserved woman who had issues with depression and anxiety. At the same time, she refused medical help, completely ignoring all attempts to send her to psychotherapy. Joel believed that she had reached a breaking point and decided to take her own life. The man claimed that prior to this, his wife had turned to the church, seeking solace in prayers, but it didn't help, and she wouldn't listen to him, refusing the assistance of a psychotherapist. In an attempt to find an outlet for her heavy thoughts, Maria started keeping a diary. Later, during a search of the house, the police found it, a place where she recorded all the thoughts that troubled her. She was afraid of losing her family and her husband, as well as harming her children through divorce, which she described in detail on the pages of her personal notes. It was evident that she deeply cherished her family. Could this have led to an attempt to voluntarily end her life by taking a lethal dose of medications, as her husband suggested? The pages of the diary provided a detailed account of the struggles she faced in the final period of her life. The detectives launched an investigation. Several versions were immediately considered at the scene, one of which was that Maria might have tried to commit suicide by taking a dangerous dose of drugs in the bathroom. Another possibility was that it could have been an accidental incident. Maria might have confused the dosage. The prospect of murder was also considered, given Joel's suspicious behavior. When the police asked to conduct a search of the house, the man flatly refused, claiming that he was a very private person and didn't want strangers in his home, rummaging through his belongings. The detectives explained that in any case, a search would have to be carried out to establish all the circumstances of what had occurred, but only later, once a warrant was obtained, and they urged him to allow it sooner. Eventually, the man agreed. While the house was being examined, the police, in conversation with the witness, became increasingly convinced that Joel was under the influence of substances. They then invited him to the station for a more detailed discussion. Here, the investigators ascertained that he was in an inadequate state. He couldn't stand up straight, sit still, was constantly sweating, and bumped into furniture when moving around. When left alone in the room, he cried, shouted, and hit the walls. The interrogation began around 4 a.m. The man claimed that he was the one who purchased the packet of medications prescribed to Maria by a doctor. The detectives tried to find out how many pills were in it initially to understand how many she had taken. But the man couldn't answer this question. It didn't seem strange, as few people count pills, but overall his answers were evasive. He appeared nervous and frightened. According to the man, he went to take a shower. When he returned, his wife was unresponsive. She was unconscious and not breathing. No more than 10 minutes had passed between these events, but the police had already ascertained that this drug couldn't have started acting so quickly, and moreover, couldn't have killed a healthy woman. Additionally, the police suspected the widower of lying for another reason. He claimed that he was taking a shower, which meant the bathroom should have been damp, with steam on the walls and moisture on the floor and in the bathtub itself. But none of this was found. Everything was completely dry, even the towel that the man had supposedly used. He was clearly lying about taking a shower in the house. During the search, the detectives discovered a packet and a needle in different parts of the house, and it was the kind of thin needle used for intravenous drips. In the home medicine cabinet, they managed to find equipment for IV lines and other syringes, but Maria didn't use any medications that needed to be administered intravenously. She had only been prescribed pills. The detectives turned to the victim's loved ones for clarification. Maria's friend helped to shed light on why there was so much medical equipment in the deceased's house, which appeared highly suspicious. The friend and her husband had come to the victim's house as soon as they learned about what had happened. They wanted to take the children to their place for a while to look after them. The couple encountered the police during the search at the crime scene. Naturally, the officers wanted to speak with them. Joel Pello's odd behavior, combined with the suspicious findings in the house, increasingly convinced the investigators that the story about Maria's suicide seemed dubious. Too many facts contradicted this version. Maria's friend told the detectives that 2 years before the woman's tragic death, her husband had undergone drastic changes in his appearance and behavior. At first, Joel had rapidly lost weight, and then he began to build muscle mass, which raised suspicions about steroid use. Alongside these physical transformations, his emotional state and psyche also changed. Despite the image of a decent family man that Joel had carefully maintained for years, he now became more uninhibited and started flirting with other women. This transformation was reflected in his social media pages as well. Whereas previously, the man had exclusively posted family photos with his wife and children, now his profiles were filled with selfies showing off his new physique and boasting about his high earnings. Joel purchased an expensive sports car that had belonged to Maria and constantly bragged about it to his friends and colleagues. It seemed that family values had taken a back seat for him, giving way to egocentrism and a thirst for self-affirmation. The situation began to escalate in 2018, shortly after Maria gave birth to their second child. It was then that Joel became infatuated with a surgical ward nurse named Janet Aranda, with whom he worked at the same hospital as his wife. He later even took his mistress on a vacation to Europe, where they visited Spain, France, and Greece. During this trip, Maria discovered who her husband was actually traveling with. She had previously noticed Joel's close communication with Janet, but trusted her beloved. Now, her suspicions of infidelity were confirmed when she accidentally came across plane tickets bearing her rival's name. It was likely this disappointment in her husband that triggered Maria's prolonged depression. Doctors prescribed her antidepressants, but Maria rarely took them, fearing addiction and side effects. Instead, she tried to fight her inner torment on her own, increasingly confiding in her diary. In its pages, Maria wrote that for the sake of the children, she didn't want to break up the marriage, which had lasted over a decade. She was afraid that the little ones would grow up without a father, but the suffering she had to endure was unbearable. Maria spoke openly about all this with her husband, making it clear that she was ready to forgive the betrayal, if only he wouldn't leave the family. And it seemed to work, because a few months later, Joel confessed that he had ended the relationship with his mistress. To make amends, he arranged a luxurious getaway for his wife in Las Vegas, accompanied by expensive gifts. Unfortunately, it turned out to be a complete lie. In reality, Joel had no intention of ending his affair with Janet. In the end, as it transpired, the man had been cheating on Maria for over 2 years, right up until her tragic death. During a police interrogation, Joel admitted that their marriage was falling apart, and he was no longer living with his wife under the same roof. According to him, about 5 months ago, he had moved in with his mistress. Of course, the detectives decided to speak with Janet personally. Early in the morning, they called her and asked her to explain her relationship with the deceased's husband. The woman was informed that Maria had died just 8 hours earlier. However, the investigators emphasized that at present, it wasn't being treated as a murder case. They were simply gathering information to find out what had actually happened and to rule out implausible versions. At the same time, the detectives weren't rushing to conclusions, waiting for the autopsy results, which were expected to shed light on the causes of Maria's death. Janet arrived at the station for questioning. She confirmed that she had been seeing Joel for over 2 years. During this entire time, he had never once mentioned his wife's inclination toward any substances. Instead, the man shared with his mistress concerns about Maria's depressive state. The police hinted to Janet that the woman might not have died of natural causes, and certainly not from an overdose. They were considering this possibility and needed to rule it out. The investigators explained to the mistress that if Maria's husband was responsible for her death, Janet herself might be in danger. Obviously, they were trying to get the woman to talk this way. And it actually worked. Janet repeated that she had never heard Joel make any threats against his wife, plans to get rid of her, or offensive statements. Therefore, the mistress refused to believe the version about his involvement in Maria's death. Janet herself behaved calmly, had an alibi, and didn't seem like a person who could be involved in this case. So they decided to exclude her from the circle of suspects. Soon, the forensic experts completed their analysis. They found no traces of pills in the deceased's stomach, neither those she had taken before, nor any others. Although, if Maria had swallowed them while the widower was in the shower, as he claimed, the medication simply wouldn't have had time to dissolve completely in just 10 minutes. The cause of Maria's death was massive mixed intoxication. Naturally, the question arose as to how exactly she could have been poisoned. A careful examination of the deceased's hands provided important clues. It showed that Maria most likely did not die from an overdose of pills. A small puncture characteristic of an IV drip with a thin needle was found in the crook of her elbow. Blood analysis confirmed that Maria died as a result of the combined effects of several powerful drugs administered intravenously. However, the exact composition of this mixture remained unknown for now. The investigators decided to conduct a thorough toxicological examination that would accurately determine which substances led to Maria's death. However, the problem was the duration of this analysis. It would take a full 4 months to complete, so the detectives had to be patient. However, experts were already expressing serious doubts about the version of voluntary departure from life. After all, it would have been extremely inconvenient and difficult for Maria to administer the drug to herself in this way. Nevertheless, they couldn't completely rule out the possibility of suicide yet. According to those close to the deceased, despite all the family troubles, Maria found solace in her children. It seemed that they were the only barrier that kept her from taking a fatal step. It is known for certain that the woman did not have an addiction to psychoactive substances. This was confirmed by her relatives and closest friends. Moreover, no matter how carefully the detectives studied Maria's diary entries, they never came across any hints of an intention to end her life. She was indeed painfully experiencing family troubles, but she didn't give up. Faced with difficulties, Maria didn't try to escape from them in such a radical way. Instead, she was determined to overcome this difficult period. Investigators found notes made literally a few days before the tragedy. It seems Maria was finally disappointed in her husband when he moved in with his mistress. Maria wrote that she wanted to move on. She had decided to divorce Joel and start a new life. These facts only intensified the detectives' suspicions. It's unlikely that a person set on radical changes would voluntarily end their life. After all, now Maria needed to raise her children on her own, whom she simply could not leave to their fate. While the police were waiting for the results of the toxicological examination, everyone who loved Maria came to say goodbye to her at the funeral. Her husband didn't miss this sad event either. At the ceremony, Joel cried and looked extremely upset. However, to the deceased's relatives, his feelings seemed too exaggerated. Everyone knew very well that the couple had been living separately recently. Moreover, Joel was building a serious relationship with another woman. So when he cried over Maria's coffin and kissed her, demonstrating suffering and grief, the deceased's friend couldn't stand it and accused him of insincerity. But despite the widower's behavior, the detectives' enthusiasm didn't wane. They were already considering this case as a murder. Given all the circumstances, Joel remained the main suspect. The investigators remembered how he tried to hide the package with pills and only later reluctantly handed it over to the police. However, experts conclusively proved that this drug was not the cause of Maria's death. The needle found on the stairs and medical equipment in the house also aroused suspicion, but this evidence was not enough to bring formal charges. Even forensic experts couldn't say exactly how Maria died. To get more information, the detectives decided to have a thorough conversation with the deceased's friends. They still couldn't prove who exactly made that fatal injection. However, in conversations with Maria's friends, the police learned interesting details. It turns out that on the Saturday before her death, the woman had another argument with Joel. Maria didn't want to let him into the house and told her husband to finally decide, her or Janet. He chose his mistress. After this, Maria became angry, left the house, got into the car, and said she would file for divorce. In response, Joel became terribly angry. He hit the windshield of the car and broke it. It seems he didn't want to hear about divorce. On Sunday morning, Maria wrote to her husband that she was looking for a lawyer to arrange the divorce. However, Joel replied that they could agree on their own. He justified this by saying that lawyers' services are very expensive, and the process would take a long time. Therefore, it would be simpler if they discussed everything face-to-face, without outsiders. The couple agreed to meet on Monday evening. Before Joel's arrival, Maria sent a message to her friend asking her to pray for her. Maria was worried about how the conversation would go, but didn't feel any danger. She had no idea that this text message would be the last in her life. Early Tuesday morning, doctors pronounced Maria dead. And finally, after 4 months of painstaking work by laboratory technicians, the results of the full toxicological examination arrived. Experts found 7 powerful drugs in the victim's blood, including marine, propol, chitarin, and lidoin. This cocktail proved fatal. Most of the substances found are used during surgical operations and need to be administered intravenously. Maria didn't have access to such medicines, but her husband did. Law enforcement believed that this information would be sufficient grounds to charge Joel with murder. In less than an hour, the man was arrested. The police put handcuffs on him when he was spending the evening with his mistress. Joel didn't resist. At the station, he refused to testify and immediately demanded a lawyer. According to the prosecutor, the suspect personally prepared a deadly cocktail for his wife and administered it intravenously. The moment when the victim received that fatal injection raised the most questions. After all, the detectives had no direct evidence that this happened forcibly or through deception. Joel's former boss helped the detectives figure out the medications. He carefully studied the list of substances found in the victim's blood. But what surprised him most was the presence of a drug called propofol. This drug is not available without a prescription and is extremely dangerous in case of overdose. The problem is that if you don't monitor the person at this time, they may simply stop breathing. Joel's former boss was shocked, as the level of propofol in the deceased's blood turned out to be the highest in all his many years of practice as an anesthesiologist. According to him, such an amount could have been enough for several serious operations. The dose was many times higher than lethal. It seems the killer was acting for sure. Having obtained this data, the police suggested that Janet knew much more than she had told during the first interrogation. So they approached her again. The mistress agreed to come to the station for another conversation with the investigators. Law enforcement obtained a warrant to search her home, but found nothing suspicious there. No needles, no medicines. After this, Janet was offered a deal. She was promised immunity from prosecution in exchange for all the information she had against Joel. The woman agreed to this proposal and agreed to talk to detectives in the presence of lawyers. This time, Janet confessed that Joel had repeatedly brought medications to her home that he took from work. He used some of them for his own consumption. The mistress listed several drugs, and 6 of them turned out to be the same ones found in Maria's blood. After a short pause, Janet added that shortly before his wife's death, Joel had brought propofol to her. Given these admissions, the prosecution finally obtained the necessary information for the court. Pending the trial, Joel was released on bail. But later he was detained again to be charged with falsifying evidence. However, the man was released on bail for the second time and remained under house arrest until the start of the trial, which began in March 2023. The prosecution called 12.5 witnesses. All these people were needed to prove the defendant's guilt. In the absence of direct evidence, prosecutors set themselves a difficult task to convince the jury that the drugs were selected specifically for Maria's murder. The prosecutors were convinced that this was not a tragic coincidence, but a carefully planned execution. The deceased's friends claimed that the couple's relationship had noticeably deteriorated just 2 months before her death. They said that the husband resorted to physical violence. He also had a significant motive for the crime. After all, in the case of divorce, the wife could claim a significant part of the property jointly acquired in marriage. Joel was facing considerable alimony and severance payments amounting to about $1 million. As evidence, prosecutors referred to the victim's diaries. In addition, an important video recording made 4 months before her death was found on Maria's mobile phone. In it, Maria was talking to her husband in the car, trying to calm him down and save the family. But Joel reacted inadequately. This made it possible to understand how he treated his wife. But in this whole story, one main question remained. How did the defendant manage to force Maria to make a lethal injection? The prosecution suggested that he had slipped a powerful sedative into her coffee. The concentration was high enough for the victim to become more compliant. Probably Maria felt unwell, and then her husband offered to help by administering medication intravenously. Despite the breakup, Maria trusted him. Combined with the effect of the sedative, this led to her stretching out her arm and allowing herself to be injected. Each of the components of the fatal cocktail separately in such a concentration could cause loss of consciousness. The woman simply could not resist, and altogether they killed her. Regardless of exactly how it happened, Joel's actions gave grounds to accuse him of premeditated murder. After all, he clearly prepared a mixture of dangerous ingredients in advance. However, all this was still based on circumstantial evidence, if not for the confession of the mistress, who became the main prosecution witness. Janet said that before leaving for the meeting with his wife that day, Joel said he was going to give her an injection. He allegedly had no intention of killing Maria, but simply wanted to calm her down. The woman believed that in this way, the man was trying to convince his wife not to demand 2 large payments in the divorce. Of course, this sounded unconvincing. Therefore, prosecutors called this testimony direct evidence of Joel's involvement in Maria's death. Also, according to the prosecution, the defendant did not immediately call an ambulance, but delayed for some time. He deliberately waited until it would be impossible to help his wife. Naturally, during this time he managed to get rid of the syringe with which he made the injection. All this was aimed at confusing the investigation. And it might have worked if the criminal had been a little more attentive and hadn't left so many traces behind. During the trial, Joel admitted that he had given his wife an injection, but he insisted that he was only trying to calm her down because she was behaving inadequately. The lawyers supported this version, arguing that the victim had been suffering from depression for a long time, drinking and abusing pills, at least for a few months before the tragedy. According to the defenders, Maria had swallowed too large a dose of medications prescribed by doctors. When her husband realized this, he decided to administer drugs that remove the effect of opiates, but he mistakenly injected propofol, which has the opposite effect and enhances the effect of narcotic substances. In the world of forensics, motive is usually the key to solving a crime. However, some cases remain a mystery, even when innocent lives are at stake. Modern technologies are revolutionizing the work of investigators, providing new tools to uncover old cases that once shocked entire cities with their brutality. Norma Garcia was born on November 16, 1960, in the small town of Mercedes, Texas. This small settlement of 15,000 residents is located near the Mexican border. Typical of rural America, Mercedes had a tight-knit community where 75% of the population worked in the agricultural sector and 90% were Spanish-speaking, including Norma's family. The girl grew up in a large family with 6 brothers and sisters, with whom she had close relationships. Norma stood out from others with her quiet demeanor and shyness, never causing any trouble. When Norma was about 12 years old, the family moved to California, settling on the outskirts of Oxnard, a city with a population of 200,000. This was a significant step for the Garcia family, especially for the children who were used to the sparsely populated Texas. The rhythm of life in Oxnard was strikingly different from their previous place of residence. Norma was most enchanted by the picturesque beaches and stunning sunsets, which she fell in love with wholeheartedly. After graduating from high school in 1980, the girl enrolled in a local college, not wanting to move away from her family. There she met Anthony Rodriguez, a sophomore who became her first true love. After nearly 2 years of dating, on March 6, 1982, 21-year-old Norma and Anthony got married. This was the first step towards creating the family Norma had dreamed of. That same year, the couple had their firstborn, Andrew, and in 1989, their second son, Austin. The Rodriguez family embodied Norma's ideal of family life. Understanding the importance of education for her children's future, the young mother took a job as an assistant manager at a local supermarket. However, despite her efforts, in 1991, the marriage began to fall apart. The couple often argued, and Anthony was increasingly absent due to work in other cities. Norma complained to her childhood friend Teresa about her husband's alcoholism, which led to violence against her and their older son. Not wanting to become a single mother, but understanding the danger of living with an aggressive man, Norma and the children moved to a duplex 10 minutes away from Anthony's house. She didn't file for divorce, trying to maintain the relationship for the sake of the children. The duplex was located in the neighboring town of Port Hueneme, with a population of about 20,000, mostly workers from local farms. Norma was particularly attracted to the local park, where she loved to walk with her children in her free time. Neighbors described Norma as friendly but reserved. She devoted herself entirely to her sons, not missing a single school game and spending all weekends with them. This period was difficult for Norma. She worked a lot, including overtime hours, striving to secure a future for her children. Tired, she found solace in communicating with her sons, always hoping for the best. No one could predict what fate awaited Norma. By March 1993, when she turned 32, she began dating a mechanic named Daniel. He was also a coach in the children's league where 11-year-old Andrew played. The couple met at a party, feeling an instant connection. Norma and Daniel had a great time together, walking in the park, often in the company of her sons, with whom Daniel quickly found common ground. Norma's friends and family described this relationship as long awaited for her. It seemed she had finally found happiness after the painful separation from her husband. However, despite the apparent idyll, around the middle of that year, Daniel suddenly announced the end of their relationship. This came as a painful blow to Norma, who saw no preconditions for such a turn of events. Daniel explained his decision by his desire to rekindle his relationship with his ex-girlfriend. This news deeply affected Norma, but she found the strength to move on. To distract herself from negative emotions, she decided to host a barbecue at her home on Saturday, May 29, 1993. She invited her sisters and her friend Beatrice to this event. After a busy weekend, Norma decided to spend Sunday, May 30th, in a calm atmosphere. She dedicated this day to her 4-year-old son Austin, mostly watching TV with him. The older son, Andrew, was visiting his father Anthony in Oxnard and was supposed to return the next day. On the evening of May 30th, Norma received a call from her friend Beatrice, suggesting they spend the next day at the beach. Having no other plans, Norma agreed, hoping it would help her distract from thoughts about her recent breakup. Nothing foreshadowed the tragedy that was about to unfold. On June 1st, at 7:47 in the morning, an alarming call came to the 911 emergency service of Port Hueneme. The caller was Anthony Rodriguez, a 33-year-old man who reported finding his ex-wife dead in her house. Law enforcement immediately responded to the call, which was unusual for a city where no murders had occurred in the past 3 years. Arriving at the scene, detectives found Anthony, his cousin Hector, and Norma's 2 sons waiting in the driveway. Inside the house, investigators were met with a gruesome and strange scene. In the living room, on the floor, lay 32-year-old Norma with no visible injuries or traces of blood. Instead, her head was tightly wrapped in silver-reinforced duct tape, resembling a mummy. The layer of tape was so thick that it had to be cut off. It was noticeable that someone had tried to remove part of the tape around the nose and mouth area, but unsuccessfully. The medical examiner determined that Norma had died more than a day ago, as evidenced by clear signs of rigor mortis. The victim's unbuttoned shorts suggested possible rape, but a definitive conclusion could only be made by the medical examiner after the autopsy. Detectives immediately suspected that the killer might have been familiar to the victim, as her face was completely covered with opaque tape. Perhaps this was done to prevent her from recognizing the attacker. No signs of struggle or break-in were found at the crime scene, nor was there a single drop of blood. Only a set of house keys was lying on the floor next to the body. Valuable items remained in the house, which apparently did not interest the criminal. The local police department, consisting of only 20 employees, threw all its forces into the investigation. Given the rarity of such crimes in the city and the obvious peculiarities of the case, experts from neighboring cities were brought in. Forensic experts thoroughly examined the site of the probable murder, but found nothing substantial for the investigation. In the evening of the same day, the victim's sister, Auralia, arrived at the house. They had planned to go shopping together, and Auralia had been unsuccessfully trying to contact Norma since early morning. Concerned by the lack of response, the young woman decided to check what had happened. She was shocked to see yellow tape already cordoning off the crime scene. The new witness willingly spoke with the police. According to Auralia, Norma had a tense relationship with her ex-husband, but she had no other ill-wishers. Investigators immediately took note of this information, knowing that Anthony was the one who reported the crime and was likely the last person to see Norma alive, not counting the children. All adults were taken to the station for questioning. Anthony Rodriguez behaved like a man stricken with grief. Despite the fact that they had separated long before these events, it seemed that he still loved this woman. He had no ideas about who could have attacked the defenseless victim. The man said that on June 1st, he arrived at his ex-wife's duplex around 7:30 in the morning, as they had previously agreed. The father was supposed to take the sons to school and kindergarten. This was the parenting schedule of the former couple, which they decided to maintain even after the separation. Anthony arrived with his brother Hector, who waited outside in the pickup truck while the father was going to pick up the children. He knocked, but no one answered. According to Anthony, the house was too quiet, and no one responded to his calls. The man became worried. He feared that something bad might have happened, but he didn't have his own key, so he couldn't get inside. Then he used his bank card, sliding it into the gap between the door and the wall, which allowed him to open the lock. Entering the house, Anthony again received no response to his calls. In the living room, he found his ex-wife showing no signs of life. He noticed that her head was wrapped, and the top part of her shorts was unbuttoned. Overcome with anxiety, Anthony ran outside and called for his brother Hector. When the men returned to the house, the children had already woken up from the noise. They also ended up in the living room and saw their mother motionless. They were immediately sent to their rooms. Seeing the situation, Hector touched the body. It seemed to him that it was still warm. The man quickly retrieved scissors from the truck's first aid kit. He tried to cut the adhesive tape around the nose and mouth, hoping the victim might be able to breathe. When he managed to do this, he realized that Norma wasn't breathing. No pulse could be felt. Norma was already dead. The detectives found these testimonies strange, as by that time the body had already begun to stiffen. Norma had died much earlier. Hector couldn't have felt any warmth. But the man explained this by his state of shock and fear. Despite such behavior seeming natural, the brothers destroyed much evidence and contaminated what remained with their fingerprints, shoe prints, and DNA samples. Law enforcement quickly determined that the ex-husband might even have had a motive. He was having a hard time dealing with the breakup and was extremely dissatisfied with her relationship with the new boyfriend. Moreover, they could have had disagreements about custody and alimony, as the children remained with their mother. According to Anthony, they had separated from his wife several years before these events, but officially, they were still not divorced. The couple maintained normal relations to set a healthy example for their sons. From the man's account, all of this seemed quite normal. However, the victim's family provided the detectives with more troubling information. Norma's sisters said that the woman was very dissatisfied with Anthony's regular visits and his persistent desire to control her. He explained this by his desire to constantly see and communicate with the children. But in the opinion of the murdered woman's relatives, the ex-husband was imposing himself specifically in the hope of rekindling the relationship. He repeatedly suggested that Norma meet and spend time together, go somewhere. But all this caused her displeasure and provoked arguments. Eventually, Hector and Anthony were asked to take a polygraph test. They agreed and passed this task without problems. The detectives were initially convinced that the men were involved in what had happened. But after the lie detector test, they were forced to let them go. Both were not written off as potential suspects. But the investigation focused on other people from the deceased's close circle. After the autopsy, the medical examiner was able to establish that there had been no rape, despite the woman's clothes being unbuttoned. Perhaps this was done to mislead. Her head was wrapped with tape 14 times. Almost the entire roll was used to mummify the victim. Cuts were found on her tongue, left from accidentally biting her tongue during this process. However, the cause of death was manual strangulation. The head was wrapped later, when she was already dead. This was the conclusion reached by the medical examiner. Then a question arose. Why use tape at all, let alone wrap the head so many times? The time frames were clarified. She was killed between 10:30 on Sunday, May 30th, and 5 o'clock in the morning on May 31st. Obviously, the younger son Austin had been in the house with his mother's body for at least 24 hours. The 4-year-old child had been walking around Norma all this time. Likely, he was the only person who could have witnessed what happened. Forensic experts collected materials from under the victim's nails, as well as from the adhesive tape. It was assumed that traces of the killer could have been left on all of this. Unfortunately, the level of technology in the 90s did not allow for a full DNA analysis. All collected physical evidence was preserved, but at that time they could not provide any valuable information. Nevertheless, the detectives managed to uncover some details. They were sure that the criminal knew his victim closely, and by wrapping tape around her head posthumously, he was trying to psychologically distance himself from what he had done. It was decided to talk to the woman's children. According to the older son Andrew, when his father brought him home on the evening of the 31st, he also couldn't get his mother to answer. But the boy noticed that the window was open enough for him to sneak into the house. It was very late, and he was surprised that the younger son Austin was still awake. He asked what the reason was. His brother replied that their mother was sick and had a bandage on her head, so he was waiting for her to get better. The older brother didn't understand what Austin meant. Andrew assumed that their mother was just resting, as she often fell asleep in the living room. He put his brother to bed and went to sleep himself, not wanting to disturb the tired woman. At first, it seemed that talking to a 4-year-old child wouldn't provide valuable information. However, to the investigators' surprise, Austin provided many details. He spoke with detectives in the presence of a child psychologist. According to the boy, on the evening of the 31st, his mother let a dark-skinned man into the house who called himself Corey. Almost immediately, an argument broke out between them. Austin claimed that he saw with his own eyes how the stranger attacked his mother and wrapped her head with adhesive tape. After that, Corey fled, but little Austin allegedly chased him even onto the street, running several dozen yards from the house. Realizing he couldn't catch up with his mother's attacker, he returned home and closed the door. This story didn't sound entirely plausible, especially regarding the chase after the criminal. 10 days later, Austin provided new information. Now he claimed that a light-skinned man named Warren entered through the kitchen door, and it was he who wrapped his mother's head with tape. This puzzled the police, as no evidence suggested that more than one person had attacked the woman. Moreover, the child radically changed his story. Eventually, this was explained by the increased attention of family members to Austin. After the murder, they talked a lot with the boy, which could have distorted his memories. Despite this, detectives quickly discovered that Corey and Warren were in the victim's immediate circle, and close ones also knew about them. Norma worked with these people and had long maintained friendly relationships with them. Warren Mackey wasn't even present at the party organized by the victim. He lived about 20 minutes' walk from her house. They often met and talked, and it was known that the man had feelings for the deceased, had asked her out several times, but was rejected. After this, he became even more persistent, often coming to Norma's house uninvited. The woman admitted that she had no romantic feelings for him, but didn't want to rudely push him away to avoid hurting him. Most witnesses described him as a calm and sweet person, but some thought he was a bit strange. Warren himself also confirmed his presence at the party organized by Norma. According to him, they talked until everyone left, then went to her house and watched TV for a while. He left for home around 10:30 in the evening, and the next day he went to meet friends in Santa Barbara. The man denied his involvement in the murder and refuted his feelings for Norma, calling their relationship purely friendly and emphasizing that he didn't seek anything more. Later, the suspect's friends confirmed his words. Corey Davis worked with Norma, unlike Warren, who was her former colleague. He denied friendship with the woman, saying they just crossed paths and communicated at work as acquaintances, and on the night of the murder, he was at home with his parents. Detectives immediately noticed that he behaved nervously during the interrogation and cooperated reluctantly, but besides this, the police noticed no alarming moments. After this, detectives continued communicating with the deceased's closest circle. Unexpectedly, her friend Beatrice reported that at the barbecue before her death, Norma complained about losing her house keys. Interestingly, they were found next to her body when the police first arrived at the call. It seemed this could be a breakthrough, and investigators decided to talk to Corey again, who aroused their suspicions and arrived at the address he provided. It turned out that he had given false information and lived elsewhere. Thus, suspicions about the dark-skinned man began to take real shape. It was decided that Corey and Warren should take a polygraph test. To the investigators' surprise, both also passed it without problems. It seemed the case was hitting a dead end. The detectives had one more person of interest on their suspect list: the woman's ex-boyfriend, named Daniel. Warren reported that shortly before the breakup, problems began in the couple. He heard about this from Norma. The boyfriend even came to the deceased's workplace once and caused a scene, so it was decided to talk to him at the station. Here, the man denied problems in the relationship, insisted that they had separated long ago and maintained a friendly connection. Now he was dating another woman and didn't care about Norma. He also denied the conflict at work. His alibi was confirmed, and Daniel successfully passed the polygraph test. Now the investigation ran out of suspects. There was nothing left but to return to the very beginning, and the police talked to the friend Beatrice again. The woman confessed that she had such a warm relationship with Norma that she became the only friend to whom Beatrice told about an affair happening behind her husband's back. Norma even allowed Beatrice to use her house so that her friend could meet this man, giving her keys for free access. At this moment, the detectives had a thought. Could Norma's best friend's husband have taken revenge on the woman for facilitating Beatrice's regular infidelities? Or could it have been the friend's lover? Suddenly, two new suspects appeared who deserved closer attention. First, investigators spoke with Beatrice's husband, but he had a confirmed alibi. In desperation, law enforcement also met with Beatrice's lover, but he was quickly crossed off the suspect list as well. The situation changed drastically when 26 days after Norma's murder, a new victim was discovered. The second deceased turned out to be Beatrice Fellis, an 87-year-old deaf-mute woman. She was found stabbed to death in her bed in a room on the third floor of a nursing home, a few blocks from Norma's residence. A month later, on August 5th, Cynthia Berger, a 44-year-old customer service manager at a local company, was found dead in a burning house. At first, firefighters were called, but upon arrival, they found her body in the bathroom. The victim had been raped, strangled, and the cause of death was smoke inhalation, as she was still alive after the torture. These events shocked the police department of the small town, where the crime rate had previously been 0. Now detectives were investigating 3 murders, suggesting a connection between them and the activity of a serial killer who urgently needed to be stopped. The investigators couldn't cope with the volume of tasks. Even the sheriff was working as a detective. Meanwhile, public pressure was mounting, with local residents organizing memorial events to draw attention to the tragedies. Given the department's lack of preparedness for such a number of crimes, an FBI agent, an expert in creating psychological profiles of criminals, was brought in to assist. Behavioral analysis indicated that the killer was very close to Norma. According to the agent, he wrapped her head with tape, not after strangulation, but before it, to depersonalize the victim and suppress feelings that could have interfered with carrying out the plan. Almost 18 months later, by November 1995, information was received about a man suspected of killing at least 5 women across the United States. He turned out to be 33-year-old Glenn Edward Rogers, and previous episodes of his criminal activity resembled the cases in the town. Glenn was known as the Casanova Killer. He was found guilty of first-degree murder of 2 women, the first in Florida in 1997, the second in California in June 1999. After his arrest, Glenn initially told police that he had committed about 70 murders and was in California during Norma's murder. Later, he retracted this confession. Glenn is a suspect in many other similar murders across the United States, but there is no evidence in these cases. He was sentenced to death in Florida and California. Since 1997, he has been on death row in Florida, awaiting execution. However, DNA test results excluded Glenn from the list of suspects. Nevertheless, after the death of the 3rd victim, the bloody events in Port Wenham ceased. The situation fundamentally changed only in 2000 with the emergence of innovative technologies in forensics. Now old evidence could be evaluated in a new light. Long-forgotten crimes began to be pulled from the archives. By 2002, after completing the analysis of collected DNA, no matches were found in the police database. However, by 2003, after repeated analyses, forensic experts managed to find a match. The DNA found under the deceased's fingernails belonged to 39-year-old Warren Mackey. This was the same former colleague of Norma who had courted her. Now everything came together at one point. Despite the fact that the man managed to fool the polygraph, usually only the most hardened sociopaths, who feel no emotions or remorse, are capable of this. He also lied about his plans for the evening after the murder, persuading friends to confirm a fabricated alibi. Investigators were amazed at how skillfully Warren managed to deceive everyone. He was the most inconspicuous suspect, whom no one could have thought of. Despite all this, the evidence in the form of DNA testing proved irrefutable. Warren's DNA samples were found on the ends of the tape discovered on the victim's face. On August 27, 2003, the killer was apprehended. During interrogation, he was given one last chance to confess. However, Warren still insisted on his version and soon refused to cooperate with the investigation, demanding a lawyer. The man was arrested and charged with murder. Preliminary hearings took place on March 2, 2004. The prosecution was still hesitant about whether to consider this case as first or second-degree murder. The situation was resolved on January 10, 2005, when Warren agreed to a plea deal and pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. However, the man refused to give any explanations for his brutal act. According to him, he was under the influence of alcohol and drugs, so he couldn't accurately remember what happened that evening. 41-year-old Warren Mackey was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 15 years. As part of the deal, he was prohibited from filing appeals. Of course, he began requesting parole as soon as he served the required minimum. But all his requests were rejected, in part thanks to the active participation of Norma's murdered relatives. Regarding the other two murders that shook the city, both criminals were found, and they were not connected to Norma. Warren Mackey is still in prison. He will get his next chance for early release in August 2028. The victim's family has stated that they will do everything in their power to prevent his release. So far, the killer has been denied. This is likely to happen in the next attempt as well. This story demonstrates how technological progress in forensics can solve crimes that remained unsolved for many years. The murder of Norma Garcia, which initially seemed an unsolvable mystery, was eventually solved thanks to DNA analysis. This case underscores the importance of preserving evidence and reanalyzing it using new methods. The story also shows how often criminals can be people we least suspect. Warren Mackey, seemingly an ordinary colleague and friend, turned out to be a cold-blooded killer. In our society, there are many individuals who sincerely strive to make the world a better place. Those who have personally experienced the hardships they now fight against prove to be the most effective in this endeavor. However, it's crucial to understand that not everyone is ready to accept help. Attempts to excessively care for a troubled individual can lead to catastrophic consequences, and as the following story demonstrates, often for the very person trying to help. Tammy Epperson was an attractive woman who had worked in the modeling industry for many years. Her career in this field ended a few years before the events described due to substance addiction. Tammy had spent her entire life in Skid Row, a disadvantaged area of Los Angeles, where she couldn't resist temptation. As a result, by the age of 30, she had fallen into the clutches of addiction. Fortunately, Tammy was aware of her situation and didn't want to accept it, so she decided to undergo rehabilitation. By the year 2000, when Tammy turned 38, she had managed to radically change her life. Despite her long struggle with addiction, she took advantage of her second chance. Tammy managed to pull herself together and break the vicious cycle, so by the time of the events described, she had completely overcome her harmful habits. Having started a new life, she decided to help other people get the same chance and steer their lives in the right direction. Tammy settled in Ballington Plaza, a government-funded residential complex. This complex was created as a shelter for those who wanted to start over. It housed both those who had just begun their fight against harmful habits and those who had already managed to overcome them. For many, this complex became a true fortress, separating them from the crime that flourished beyond its walls. The territory was fenced, guarded around the clock, and every visitor had to register in a special logbook upon entry. Residents also had to check out when leaving. Unfortunately, all these measures proved insufficient to protect Tammy. She lived in a small studio on the first floor, where she fell victim to an attack by an unknown assailant. It was a brutal crime, an example of extreme violence that was shocking even for Skid Row. When police detectives arrived at the scene around 9 p.m. on November 13, 2000, they saw walls and floors covered in blood. The attacker acted with such brutality that blood was literally everywhere, even on the ceiling. For many police officers, this case became the most vivid manifestation of human cruelty, etched in their memory for life. At the crime scene, investigators found utter chaos. In the small apartment, approximately 33 feet by 39 feet, everything that could be broken was shattered. Furniture, glass and ceramic items, household appliances. Everything was broken into pieces and scattered on the floor. All these items were also splattered with blood. Tammy's belongings were strewn across the bed, as if the perpetrator was looking for something specific. Police officers speculated that he might have attacked in search of money or illegal substances. The victim's body lay on the floor in a pool of blood. She was partially naked, her underwear pulled down, and her face severely mutilated. The inner thighs and groin area were cut and torn. Investigators suspected she might have been a victim of rape, given the position of the body, the nature of the wounds, and the partial absence of clothing. From the first seconds at the crime scene, officers felt horror. Some forensic experts working in the room couldn't withstand the gruesome scene. Blood was everywhere, and the condition of the body was horrific. Due to the small area of the room and the incredible brutality of the attacker, blood spatter covered absolutely all surfaces. According to the police, the criminal attacked the 38-year-old woman and slammed her against the wall several times. She immediately sustained serious injuries, causing disorientation or even loss of consciousness. Unfortunately, this wasn't enough for the perpetrator. He continued to beat her for a long time while Tammy was already lying on the floor. The attacker used everything within reach. It was obvious that such a brutal assault took quite a long time. First, the unknown assailant mercilessly dealt with the apartment's resident, and then methodically searched everything, scattering and breaking everything around. Undoubtedly, this must have created a lot of noise. However, none of the neighbors reported to the police during the attack. According to the detectives, the degree of body decomposition indicated that Tammy had died at least a day before the police arrived. Despite this, all the neighbors claimed they hadn't heard anything. This was an obvious lie, as the apartments lacked proper sound insulation, and the scale of destruction was such that it was simply impossible to carry out quietly. In reality, it was a close friend of the victim who contacted the police. He didn't know what could have happened to her, but he couldn't reach the woman for several hours, so he suspected something was wrong. Eventually, he learned from third parties that Tammy was probably dead. When he contacted the police, it turned out that law enforcement had no information about this incident. However, the man's words interested the dispatchers, and they decided to send patrol officers to check if everything was all right in the missing woman's apartment. Even a superficial examination of the body showed an extremely high level of violence demonstrated by the attacker. He clearly had serious reasons for such aggression or long-standing anger, as he dealt with Tammy with horrifying cruelty. The victim's once attractive face had become unrecognizable due to brutal disfigurement. One of the woman's eyes was gouged out, and her throat was repeatedly slashed with glass shards. Experts identified at least 3 severe blows to the face. The likely tool for inflicting these injuries was a large screwdriver, which law enforcement found under the deceased's shoulder. Deep round holes led forensic experts to believe that this tool was used to commit the crime. One of the detectives hypothesized that the motive for the attack could have been the woman's beauty. Tammy was indeed exceptionally attractive. It seemed as if someone wanted to destroy her appearance specifically. Unfortunately, the perpetrator managed to achieve his goal. All the blows were concentrated on the victim's face and neck. Deep stab wounds and cuts deprived her of any chance of surviving this brutal attack. A special expert in blood spatter pattern analysis was called to the scene of the tragedy. In this situation, he could most accurately recreate the sequence of events by studying the gruesome picture in the apartment. However, to collect all the data and compose a complete picture of the crime scene, it took him 7 hours of work just in the victim's dwelling. After that, several more hours of continuous analysis went into recording, processing, and systematizing the data. A significant number of bloodstains were found in the bathroom, although the body was in the living room. Presumably, the attack occurred when she was in the bathroom. Several bloody traces were found that could have been left from pressing the woman's bloody head against the wall. Several such stains were immediately found at different heights. It seemed as if she was being strangled by someone strong, trying to lift her off the floor. Moreover, at the moment of the attack, the bathroom door was closed, as evidenced by blood drops on its inner side. A trail of blood drops led from the bathroom to the living room. It appeared that the criminal carried the victim's body to the living room in his arms, causing droplets to fall downward. After this, Tammy was placed on the floor, and the torture continued. Evidently, it was at this moment that she received those deep screwdriver wounds, as well as the cuts to her throat that eventually led to her death. Forensic experts had an enormous amount of work, as the attacker used several murder weapons at once. He not only beat his victim with a screwdriver, inflicting blows to the face, but also cut her throat with glass shards found in the room. Several pieces of furniture also looked suspicious, particularly a wooden chair leg. All of this was thoroughly covered in blood and left at the crime scene, and therefore could contain valuable evidence and DNA samples that would help identify the brutal killer. All materials were collected and sent to the laboratory for detailed analysis. It was assumed that the perpetrator could not have avoided injuring himself during such an execution, so forensic experts hoped to find his blood as well. Among the household items used by the attacker was a footstool. This piece of furniture couldn't even be identified in the initial stages of the investigation. It was literally shattered into small splinters, but was completely covered in blood. A similar condition was observed in an unidentified glass item, which detectives initially took for a lighting fixture. However, in the laboratory, it was determined that it was actually a heavy, thick-walled flower vase. The decorative object was broken into several pieces, each of which had a large number of bloodstains. The fragments of these items looked as if they had been used to slit the throat and beat the victim. Forensic experts believed that the criminal broke all these objects against his victim, while she lay unconscious in the center of the room. This monster took item after item and beat Tammy until the object broke completely. After that, the killer would grab the next item and continue the execution. What was most shocking was that the inevitable loud noise was completely ignored by the residents of the complex. Forensic experts managed to determine that the criminal sequentially broke a candlestick in the bathroom against his victim, then the footstool and vase, and finally used a lamp, on which the most blood was found. During the examination of the victim's small apartment, police officers discovered several valuable pieces of evidence. In the bathroom sink lay a bloody rag, which likely contained traces of the attacker's blood. It was later discovered that it had Tammy's DNA on it, meaning the killer had attempted to conceal traces of the assault by wiping away blood. But apparently, he then abandoned this idea, realizing the scale of the atrocity and understanding that it could take days. Obviously, he simply left everything and departed. There was also a water bottle with a red fingerprint on its surface. A large number of paper towels with similar traces were found in the trash can. In addition to the brutal assault, Tammy was raped, as her underwear and clothes remained pulled down. These assumptions were confirmed by the forensic expert. The examination revealed traces of blood on the intimate parts of the victim's body, indicating that contact with the attacker occurred after the beating. Experts took samples for DNA analysis, hoping to identify the likely killer. Given the nature of the attack, law enforcement immediately began searching for potential enemies in Tammy's immediate circle. Several items were found in her apartment that she obviously considered valuable and had framed. However, there were no photographs of relatives, friends, or partners among them. Instead, there were pictures from her modeling career, an education diploma, and a certificate of completion of an addiction treatment program. It was evident that these items held special significance for the victim. The apartment was neat and clean, decorated with angel figurines and flowers. This dwelling starkly contrasted with the typical home of someone suffering from addiction or connected to the criminal world. According to acquaintances and all indications, Tammy had indeed overcome her destructive habits and was leading a normal life. However, her social circle still included many suspicious individuals, particularly those struggling with addictions. Just a few years ago, Tammy had been in a harsh criminal environment. Tammy not only managed to overcome her attraction to illegal substances, but also found a rather prestigious job. She secured a position as an office manager at a Hollywood telephone service that catered to celebrities. Additionally, the woman became involved in volunteer work. A church located near the residential complex offered her the opportunity to counsel people battling addiction. She agreed, seeing it as a chance to help those in need. Considering that the attacker sought to destroy her beauty, and the fact that she was an extremely attractive woman, investigators speculated that the perpetrator could be a rejected lover or a secret admirer who never received reciprocation from Tammy. Almost immediately, detectives received information about a potential perpetrator. One of the complex residents, who wished to remain anonymous, told them about a suspect. The first person on the list was Ronald Sims, whom everyone called Ron. This man also had a long history of addiction to hard substances, which he continued to struggle with. Moreover, he had dated Tammy for a while. Their relationship ended when the woman managed to overcome her addiction, but he never found the strength to break the vicious cycle. Nevertheless, they continued to communicate regularly and maintained a friendly relationship. The woman was convinced that Ron needed her help, so she essentially counseled him and supported him by her own example. The police immediately contacted Ron, as he turned out to be a potential candidate for the role of the killer. However, he categorically denied his involvement. He said that he maintained a friendly relationship with the deceased. They didn't argue, and he could never have harmed her. Instead, the man shared a more sinister story. According to him, he maintained a relationship with Tammy, not only in hopes of getting rid of his own problems, but also to provide her with protection. The fact was that during the consultations she conducted at the church, the woman met a suspicious man. He became a real stalker, so Ron was backing her up. This man's name was Troy Powell. At the time of Tammy's death, he was 32 years old. The new suspect was on probation after another imprisonment. It turned out that the three of them were friends, socializing in the same company and attending church together. But it always felt that Troy was in love with Tammy. From their first acquaintance, he began meeting the mentor after work, giving her flowers and stuffed toys. He waited for her in his pickup truck almost every day and offered her rides. During this period, there was a bus driver's strike in the city, so Tammy sometimes accepted this offer, although she usually rode with others. Troy suffered from addiction, and the deceased considered him potentially dangerous, so she very rarely rode with him. She confessed more than once to her ex, Ron, that she only used Troy's help in exceptional cases. It was still less risky than walking the streets of one of the most dangerous areas of the city. The man misinterpreted her agreement to ride with him. Troy became convinced that he had a chance. In reality, Tammy was not only forced to use his help, but also wanted to help the man deal with his problems. She gave him advice, supported him, but kept her distance and didn't want any romantic relationship. The woman repeatedly stated this directly to her admirer, but he continued to become more insistent. Recently, his obsession with Tammy had become more pronounced, and the woman tried to avoid crossing paths with him. Tammy's close ones believed that he was involved in the woman's murder. Troy was hot-tempered and aggressive, as well as obsessed with her. A chilling discovery was found in the victim's apartment, a phone notebook in which the deceased kept a record of all calls from this suspicious person. There were a large number of notes indicating what time Troy called and how long the conversation lasted. In the notebook, Tammy also recorded the results of the conversations, noting the presence of threats or other alarming moments. For the most part, she ended such conversations by asking him not to bother her anymore. However, Troy usually called again the same day, and this pattern repeated for a long time. Soon, one of the suspect's acquaintances informed Ron that Troy had confessed to the murder. After this, Ron immediately called the police and passed on this information. According to the witness, Troy said that he had visited Tammy. They had a nice chat, had intimate contact, then argued, and in a fit of rage, he took the woman's life. Despite the detailed account, law enforcement was not sure of the truthfulness of Ron's words. They detained him and took him to the station to clarify the circumstances. He also remained on the list of suspects due to his criminal past. Ron had a criminal record for theft, and even a potential motive for revenge, jealousy towards his ex-girlfriend, but the man was later released. Meanwhile, Troy couldn't be found. He disappeared in a city with a population of 4 million, possibly fleeing with a head start of several hours. The logbook records of the residential complex where the deceased lived were checked. It turned out that Troy did indeed enter the building on the day of the murder, and only left several hours later. When the likely killer was leaving the building, he was asked about Tammy, as it was forbidden to leave without being accompanied by residents. The criminal then replied with a smile that the woman was resting. They believed him and let him pass. He was the last person to visit the deceased's apartment, which further increased suspicions about him. On the same day, according to Ron, he and Tammy had planned work at the church. He called her, but Tammy never answered, which seemed strange as she always willingly communicated by phone. The church reported that the woman had not shown up. The next morning, Ron went to her workplace, but Tammy wasn't there either. The man couldn't get into the residential complex territory because at this time he had relapsed and started using illegal substances again. He was simply not allowed into his friend's apartment. But he noticed that Troy's red pickup truck was parked on the street near the house, which caused him concern. He continued to call her persistently, but Tammy still didn't answer, so he contacted the police. Detectives reconstructed the picture of the fatal day and concluded that on the eve of the murder, after church, Tammy was picked up by her stalker. They stopped at a store and bought a Bible, which the woman gave to Troy. She believed he was on the path to reformation. Apparently, the man managed to convince her under some pretext to let him into her home. According to Tammy's close friends, she had no intention of giving Troy a chance, but she was always a bit naive, so he might have simply convinced her that he needed help or advice regarding his addiction. The woman threw herself wholeheartedly into this activity, sincerely believing she was making the world a little better, and probably couldn't refuse. That's how he gained entry to her dwelling. Unfortunately, she trusted her surroundings too much, which were far from ideal. Detectives checked Troy Powell's criminal background. It turned out that he had a significant list of offenses, including serious crimes. Among them were the use and distribution of narcotic substances, burglary, and rape. He had served a term for assaulting another woman, whom he had also stalked. That woman miraculously survived his attack. The man clearly posed a threat to society, especially to females. At the same time, he had a masculine appearance, was muscular and tall, giving the impression of a tough guy, which attracted girls. The police sent out an alert to search for this person's vehicle, a red pickup truck. Ron described it in detail, as he had repeatedly seen the vehicle in which the likely killer met Tammy. The very next day after the detectives arrived at the scene of the crime, investigators received a tip. It turned out that Troy had been seen at a friend's house in San Pedro, approximately 19 miles from the complex. Likely, he was hiding from another person who was also on parole. Police were called to this address. They managed to find out that Troy had left his pickup and departed about 45 minutes ago. Given the fact that the suspect wasn't using his car, he could literally dissolve into the city crowd. However, the very next morning, law enforcement got lucky. The pickup truck was retrieved during the night. Fortunately, one of the patrol officers who regularly checked the hotel for parolees spotted an unfamiliar vehicle in the parking lot that same morning. It turned out to be the distinctive red pickup truck. The officer ran the license plate and discovered that the vehicle belonged to Troy, who was wanted. Detectives were informed and arrived at the scene to apprehend the main suspect. Police waited outside the building for the killer to retrieve his car. They managed to detain the driver. He was a burly, tall man. The most suspicious fact was his baseball cap, on which investigators found drops of blood. The detained man insisted that his name was Charles Vanoy. A check of his documents confirmed the truthfulness of his words. Despite this, it was decided to detain the man and examine the red stains on his headwear. According to his account, his acquaintance Troy had given him the car the previous day, and at night took it back along with a jacket, camera, and other items. In reality, these two were former cellmates, so they maintained contact even after their release. Law enforcement immediately conducted a search of the hotel room. Inside the camera, they found film, which, when developed, revealed several photographs depicting Tammy, Charles, and Troy. According to Charles, they all met at the church where Tammy was helping people rehabilitate after struggling with addiction. Unfortunately, DNA analyses took much longer, but it was eventually established that the blood on the baseball cap did not belong to the victim of the crime. They decided to interrogate Charles. After some time, he admitted that he possessed valuable information, but was willing to share it in exchange for protection from persecution. The police agreed. According to the criminal, Troy had confessed to the assault on his secret love, from whom he could never get reciprocation. He had given him the pickup truck and was planning to hide from the police. At the same time, his cellmate claimed that the killer did not rule out the possibility of voluntarily surrendering to law enforcement. Charles Vanoy insisted on his non-involvement in the assault. However, during the interrogation, he provided information that clearly only the perpetrator or a witness could know. The man was aware that Tammy's throat had been cut and that she had been stabbed several times in the face with a screwdriver. However, it remained unclear whether his former cellmate had told him these details or if he had been present at the crime scene himself. Thus, Charles was forced to cooperate with the investigation, so he informed the detectives that Troy was supposed to call him at 7 p.m. that same day. The man agreed to help law enforcement catch the killer. The friends connected by phone, and at that moment, the police managed to establish the address where the criminal was located. He was apprehended while watching an adult film in a hotel. Tammy's office keys were also found there. As it turned out, he was planning to rob it. His DNA was found on the deceased's body after the rape. His numerous bloody fingerprints were found on many objects, and the victim's blood was on his clothes, so no one doubted Troy's involvement in the crime. According to Troy's confession, he did indeed kill Tammy, but he was in an insane state. The criminal said that he suffered from mental disorders and had not been taking his prescribed medication for a long time during this period due to lack of funds to purchase them. According to him, he came to visit his beloved woman. They had consensual sex because they were dating. But later, another man called her, and this enraged him greatly. Tammy refused to discuss this call with Troy and simply went to the bathroom. He followed her, closed the door, and delivered several punches to her head. According to him, he remembered nothing after that. By this point, part of the analysis of the collected evidence had been completed. It turned out that all the fingerprints belonged to the detainee. At this stage, forensic experts suspected that this attack was something more than just rape and beating. It was believed that he had tortured his victim. The killer was charged with premeditated murder, burglary, rape, and torture. Collectively, all of this provided strong grounds for the prosecution to seek the death penalty. However, Troy was not going to give up so easily. He claimed that he had been battling a mental disorder all his life, which prevented him from standing trial. Eventually, the hearing had to be postponed due to a psychiatric evaluation. Its results proved that the criminal had not lost his mind during the attack. He described the chronology of events to his friend Charles in quite detail, who became one of the main witnesses for the prosecution. Troy himself cited childhood trauma as the reason for the attack. According to him, he had suffered from the cruelty of his alcoholic father throughout his childhood. All this resulted in deviations that made him unable to withstand rejection from a woman and instantly fall into a rage, losing control of himself. All of this was confirmed by a psychiatrist. One of the key stages of the hearing was Troy's testimony for the defense. Usually such episodes do more harm to the accused, but he was well acquainted with the judicial system, so his words sounded quite complex. He admitted that he could have been the killer, but claimed he remembered nothing. At the same time, the defendant believed that the woman was still alive when he left the apartment, so, in his opinion, the murder was unintentional. Troy also denied any problems with the opposite sex that his psychiatrist had mentioned. His mother and 2 sisters testified on behalf of the accused. In reality, they all had stories about how Troy's attacks had led to serious injuries. He had even broken his own mother's spine and pushed his sister down the stairs a few years before these events, and then claimed that he had a memory lapse. Nevertheless, his relatives continued to insist that he was a good person and incapable of such a brutal assault. The testimony of forensic experts spoke to the contrary. One of the prosecutor's most chilling claims was that he had tortured his victim for a long time before her death. Forensic experts found torn wounds in Tammy's groin area. According to the specialists, these were the most horrific mutilations they had seen in their entire careers. They testified to the brutal beating of the victim, not to consensual intimate contact. The jury decided that Troy Powell was guilty of all charges and sentenced him to death. Currently, he is awaiting the execution of his sentence, being on death row in San Quentin prison.
Usually, when it comes to love, weddings, and children, people imagine something sweet and pleasant. Such events evoke feelings of euphoria and joy, but by no means fear. And definitely, no one would think that something so horrific could happen. Gladys Ricart, a young woman from the small town of Tamboril in the Dominican Republic, was single-handedly raising her young son in 1979. At the age of 20, she had already experienced an unsuccessful romance while still in school, which left her with a child in her arms. Gladys' sister, Norma, was already living in the United States, and Gladys cherished the dream of joining her one day. To fulfill her aspiration, Gladys worked tirelessly, saving every penny she earned. She lived very modestly, denying herself everything and devoting all her time to work. And finally, her efforts paid off. She was able to move to the USA and settle with her sister's family in Manhattan, in the heart of New York. Unfortunately, at the beginning of her stay in America, Gladys did not have enough money to take her son with her, so little Davis stayed with relatives in his homeland. Immediately after moving, the woman began to learn English and got a job, working tirelessly to save money and bring her child to the States. And so, in 1983, her dream came true. She reunited with her 4-year-old son. Realizing that her prospects were limited without an education, Gladys enrolled in college. She sought to increase her chances of getting a good job and start building a career. After completing her studies at the Faculty of Economics, the woman began to work in the field of accounting. Thanks to her abilities and diligence, she quickly became a high-class specialist and one of the most valuable employees of the firm. Step by step, Gladys climbed the career ladder, starting from the very bottom, and eventually reached the position of chief accountant in a large travel agency in the center of Manhattan. She was not at all like a typical immigrant. Gladys had mastered English perfectly, received an education, achieved success in a good job, and was saving money for her own home. In fact, she had brought her American dream to life. The only thing left was to find love and create a complete family. But in this matter, Gladys was very careful. It might have seemed that she was more focused on her career than on relationships and marriage. However, this was only a deceptive first impression. In fact, she dreamed of meeting her soulmate. In 1992, 10 years had already passed since Gladys moved to the USA. Every day she traveled the same route, in the morning by subway to the office, and in the evening back home, where she lived with her sister. It was on the subway that she met Agustin Garcia, one of the leaders of the Dominican community in the state, a prominent figure who had managed to build a successful career by the age of 40. Like our heroine, he had moved to the USA from the Dominican Republic at one time. This happened when he was still young. Just like Gladys, the man had come a long way, rising from poverty to successful entrepreneurship. At the time of their acquaintance, Augustin owned several small firms and was the father of 2 children from a previous marriage. Both lived with him in a large house. But it was not this that brought Augustin fame. In the local Dominican community, he held a prominent place as an ever-helpful person, always ready to come to the aid of his neighbor. Knowing from his own experience how difficult it is to immigrate and start life from scratch, he sincerely sought to help all those who dared to try their hand at this thorny path. Augustin became the director of the Dominican Chamber of Commerce in New York and several other organizations related to his native country. At the same time, he not only held positions, but also led active social activities. Thanks to his efforts, several kindergartens and schools were opened. He became a respected and influential member of the community. This man seemed like an ideal match for Gladys, an equally purposeful and sensitive young woman. One of the most attractive traits of Augustin, in Gladys's opinion, was his compliant nature. He behaved like a true gentleman, polite, sociable, so he immediately attracted the attention of our heroine. In fact, their meeting was a pure coincidence, because Augustin almost never used the subway. That day he found himself there by a combination of circumstances. His car broke down. The wealthy businessman was immediately enchanted by the beauty Gladys, and he decided to get to know her. They talked for the rest of the ride, and then exchanged phone numbers to meet again soon. This is how their romance began. Augustin constantly invited his beloved to restaurants, treated her to exquisite dishes, and gave her expensive gifts. Gladys's family rejoiced for her when they learned about her new boyfriend. This man was a worthy candidate for the role of husband and father to her son. The couple dated for over a year before Augustin decided he was ready to take their relationship to the next level. He offered Gladys to move in with him. The young mother gladly accepted this long-awaited proposal. Confessing to her relatives and loved ones, Gladys dreamed more than anything of a wedding during this period. She cherished the hope that Augustin would propose to her, and they would be able to raise 3 children together. In addition, the woman aspired to give birth to their own babies. By the time Gladys turned 33, she finally moved in with her beloved. But from the very beginning of their life together, the situation began to deteriorate. Davis, Gladys's son, found it very difficult to get along with Augustin's children. The boy made considerable efforts, especially at the request of his mother, who literally begged him to seek common ground with everyone in every possible way. But the man's children were too arrogant and often provoked Gladys's son into conflicts. Unfortunately, it was not possible to establish a relationship. The atmosphere only intensified. At the same time, Augustin invariably took the side of his children, even if they were clearly in the wrong. This caused significant tension in the couple. After 2 years of such a life and endless arguments, Gladys realized that she no longer wanted to torment her son and told her man about the impossibility of their living together. Augustin agreed with her, but did not break off the relationship. He helped the woman find new housing, which was located 9 minutes away from his house. It was a spacious 2-story house for which the man spared no money for his beloved. It seemed that in this way, it was possible to smooth out the sharp edges in their relationship. The couple continued to see each other when Augustin visited Gladys. At that time, Gladys's circle had become so used to her chosen one that they considered him almost a member of the family. The wealthy businessman everywhere introduced his companion as his wife, despite the fact that they were not officially married. Gladys did not stop trying to persuade the man to have a wedding, but he flatly refused, citing his previous unsuccessful marriage. Augustine insisted that he no longer wanted to officially marry and have children together, so he saw no point in unnecessary bureaucratic hassles. According to Gladys's loved ones, over time, the situation reached a critical point when Gladys's happiness in this relationship began to fade. After a few years of romance, the man's unpleasant character traits became apparent. It turned out that he periodically had affairs on the side and also began to demonstrate increasingly controlling behavior. The situation escalated. Gladys was aware of all this, but remained silent for a long time, not wanting problems. Unfortunately, her inaction only exacerbated the problems in the relationship. During another argument, Augustin pulled out his gun and chased the woman. She managed to hide in the bathroom and lock the door. But from that moment, Gladys realized that it was time to break ties with her boyfriend. However, fear of the manipulator still did not allow her to leave for some time. She was looking for a convincing reason so that Augustin would not have any arguments. The easiest way was to catch the cheater in his affairs on the side. The situation escalated until the fall of 1998, when Gladys finally visited Augustin's office and caught him with another woman. This was an excellent opportunity to end the relationship. She immediately told the man that it was over, moved out of his house, and also notified all her relatives about it so that everyone knew that the wealthy businessman was no longer a welcome guest in Gladys's home. Despite the breakup, Augustine was not ready for such changes. He perceived Gladys as his property, which he had owned for 7 years. After this quarrel, he constantly called her, left gifts on the doorstep, bouquets of flowers, and even a Bible. Our heroine considered these to be pathetic attempts to win her back, but the family saw something more in this. It seemed that the man was making symbolic gifts with a hidden meaning. In any case, the woman was not going to renew her relationship with him under any circumstances. Several months passed, and during her lunch break at a restaurant, Gladys met James Preston Jr. The new acquaintance also worked in the field of accounting and worked part-time as a musician. From the first glance, there was a mutual attraction between them. After just a few dates, the couple decided to formalize their relationship officially. For 2 months, James and Gladys spent all their free time together. Finally, a wedding date was set, September 26, 1999. Our heroine and her family were happy because the woman's long-standing dream of a wedding in a white dress was about to come true. Gladys was engrossed in pleasant hassles of wedding preparations, so much so that she did not even realize how almost every night Augustin would come to her house and watch her for hours. He clearly still had not been able to overcome his proprietary feelings. On August 12th, a month and a half before the wedding, Gladys and her fiancé were enjoying a quiet, romantic evening at the bride's house. Suddenly, Augustin appeared at the doorstep. At first, he calmly asked to talk to his ex, but she refused. Then the man lost his temper, started shouting, and then threw stones at the windows. Fearing further aggression, Gladys called the police. Augustin was detained, but she decided not to press charges so that her ex would not have problems. Moreover, she herself did not want to be distracted from preparing for the celebration, which turned out to be a huge mistake. On September 24th, just 2 days before the wedding, Gladys went to the store to buy everything necessary for the bridesmaids. As it turned out, all this time she was being followed by her ex. The man ambushed her in one of the supermarket departments and hugged her as if they were on good terms and were even a couple. Gladys did not resist so as not to provoke the stalker's anger. They just exchanged a couple of words and then said goodbye. That same evening, she talked with her future husband and family. The woman complained about Augustin's behavior, which caused her concern and became too intrusive. Unfortunately, she did not even realize how dangerous he was. And then came the long-awaited day, September 26, 1999. 39-year-old Gladys was at home with her family and friends. The woman was preparing for the ceremony. She got dressed, did her hair, and makeup. The bride was beaming with happiness, which was captured in photos and videos. These turned out to be the last moments of her life. At this time, the groom was already waiting for her in the church, but circumstances developed in such a way that this happy moment was overshadowed by blood. Without any warning, the bride's ex-boyfriend stalker entered the doors of the living room where Gladys was. The man abruptly took a .38 caliber pistol out of his bag and shot the bride 3 times. The first bullet hit her in the shoulder, the second in the spine, and the third in the head. After the third shot, the victim died instantly. The paramedics who arrived later were powerless. The woman's dream of a wedding remained unfulfilled. The shooter was immediately detained and taken to the police station. He did not try to escape and did not resist during the arrest. Here, Augustin talked to one of the investigators. The killer confessed that he was heading to his house in Manhattan and decided to drive his car past his ex's house. He did this constantly. From these words, it seemed that such behavior was real stalking. But Augustin did not see anything special in these trips, explaining it by his sentimentality. That morning, September 26th, he was stunned by the large number of people in dresses and tuxedos, as well as several limousines in front of his ex's house. He had no idea that Gladys was getting married. The man was so surprised that he drove up and down the street several times before stopping opposite. Augustin still did not understand whose wedding it was and decided to go inside to find out what exactly was happening. As soon as the man got out of his car on the opposite side of the street, the victim's brother, a young man named Juan, approached him. He was cautious, knowing about the ex's bad temper. The relative tried to convince him to leave so as not to ruin Gladys's wedding. Then Augustin realized that his ex was marrying someone else, but did not show it. The man wriggled out. According to Augustin, he was invited to the celebration, so the brother did not interfere, and he calmly entered the house. No one argued with him. When the criminal was first asked to describe the shooting in the house, the killer claimed that he did not remember anything. But after some time, Augustine confessed to detectives that he always carried a weapon with him, and on that day, he brought it into the house. When asked why he dealt with an innocent woman, he refused to answer. The very next day, The detainee was brought to the courthouse for a preliminary hearing. It was supposed to read out the list of charges against him. Here he had a chance to plead guilty, avoid an exhausting trial, and achieve a mitigation of the sentence. But he did not do it. It was decided to keep the defendant in custody with a bail of $5 million, which indicated the great threat that the criminal poses to society. The image of a kind and influential person instantly collapsed. This attack became a high-profile crime. As a result of the active work of the media, the story gained wide publicity. Journalists vied with each other to publish loud statements, rumors, and the most absurd assumptions. The killer's photograph began to appear regularly in the national news. The scale of this case attracted lawyers, including first-class specialists, who simply wanted to make a name and career for themselves in a high-profile murder case. The trial of the businessman was scheduled for October 2, 2001. Thus, the defense had almost 2 years to thoroughly prepare for the case and form a positive image of the criminal. Hired lawyers immediately began working with the media, holding press conferences, and speaking to the public. All this was required in order to form a certain opinion of people regarding the crime committed. Namely, the lawyers tried to portray Agustin as a victim. The first attempt they made was to accuse Gladys's brother, Juan, and the victim's son of attacking the uninvited guest. They argued that the shooter did not actually intend to kill his ex. It happened by accident when he began to defend his life from the aggressive Juan and Davis, who attacked him together. At the same time, the defenders began to tarnish the image of the victim, portraying the murdered bride as unfaithful, accusing her of numerous betrayals. They say Gladys and Augustine were going to resume their relationship, but behind his back, the woman was preparing to marry another. That is why the killer pulled the trigger, because of the emotional breakdown that occurred. Augustine was shocked to see his beloved woman getting married, of course, not to him. Although only the day before, they were walking through the supermarket holding hands, and at that moment, Juan attacked him, which provoked shots from the pistol. According to the defenders, it was a crime in the heat of passion, which, according to the laws of the state, was considered manslaughter. In this case, the accused faced a much milder punishment. For Augustine, it was 5 to 10 years in prison instead of life imprisonment. A significant role in the recognition of this position by the public was played by the man's bright image. In fact, the accused was known as a caring and compassionate person who put all his heart and soul into the Latin American community of New York. As soon as false rumors spread that Gladys was cheating on Augustine, attitudes toward her immediately deteriorated. There were even people who believed that the victim got what she deserved. All this came as a real shock to the Ricard family. After Gladys's loved ones realized the colossal damage the killer's lawyers were doing, they began to attend every press conference, trying to defend the good name of the murdered bride. The victim's brothers and sisters, as well as her parents, insisted that the rumors of infidelity were a dirty lie. They claimed that the relationship between the killer and his victim had long been severed and was no longer restored. It was Augustine who continued his obsessive stalking of the woman. He behaved inadequately, but only because of Gladys's compassion. He did not have problems with the law before the murder. Unfortunately, he himself was incapable of compassion. Information about the activities of the killer's defenders reached the judge. Attending press conferences and interviews with journalists were officially banned. However, they had already managed to cause colossal damage to the victim's image. This became a problem for the prosecution even during the trial. In court, the lawyers continued to portray the criminal as a victim, tarnishing the murdered bride's name in every possible way. Gladys's family insisted that the attack was intentional. They even had one important trump card. It turned out that the attack process, as well as the bride's death, were recorded on tape. The beginning of the celebration and the preparation were filmed on camera. Augustine did not notice it. When the first stage of the hearings was scheduled, only the judge had the right to view this video recording. The defenders continued to insist that this material should not be shown to the jury. They called it all an unfair advantage for the prosecution. The lawyers twisted as much as they could to prevent this most important argument of the prosecution. After lengthy discussions, the court decided that the evidence could be used, but only the moment where the shooting of the bride was directly captured. It was a 15-second fragment, and the prosecution doubted that it would be enough to convince the jury. Given that this moment of the recording could be taken out of context, it gave the lawyers room for maneuver. The defenders continued to build their tactics, arguing that the sudden attack of the victim's brother and son forced Augustine to take up arms, and the 3 bullets that hit Gladys were fired by accident. Despite the protests of the victim's family, the killer's lawyers insisted that all this was caused by her promiscuous lifestyle. Several witnesses were provided by the defense, in particular, the family that lived next door to Augustine. A father and his daughter testified in court, claiming that they had seen Gladys at the killer's house just a few days before the incident. They even believed that the lovers were still a couple and living together, although in fact, the woman had come to him to pick up her things that had remained. Thanks to these manipulations, the lawyers managed to gain the sympathy of the jury for the criminal. Fortunately, the prosecution had something to answer with. Of course, the tactic was mainly based on the video recording. These were sad shots in which the criminal took the life of his ex in front of her family members, including her son. Obviously, he was not defending himself because all the bullets fired hit the victim. After this demonstration of what happened, the prosecution began to point out other obvious flaws in the lawyer's version. In particular, the 15-second recording showed no evidence that the killer was attacked after entering Gladys's house. No one even approached him. Despite this, Augustine pulled out a weapon and opened fire. Moreover, he did not try to defend himself, since the barrel of the loaded pistol was aimed at the bride from the beginning to the last second. The attack was clearly a deliberate act of revenge on the grounds of jealousy, because the criminal came to the house with a weapon ready to kill. Not only was the pistol full of bullets, but he also took spare ones with him, apparently in case a full drum was not enough for the execution. Well, the lawyers had their own answers to this. Augustine was a well-known businessman, a wealthy person who could have his own enemies, so he always carried a loaded weapon with him in case of self-defense. The prosecution also tried to refute the lies of the lawyers, who portrayed the victim as promiscuous. There was ample evidence that after the breakup, the ex-boyfriend had stalked the woman for a long time. All her relatives stated this. The victim's own son was wary of Augustine, knowing how cruel this person was. His kindness and selflessness were just a mask that hid the real face of the criminal. Augustine's surveillance and unpredictable visits lasted at least the last few months. A list of license plate numbers of cars parked near Gladys's house was found in the offender's car. He was not just stalking his future victim, but conducting a real census of every person who was constantly in her area. Probably in this way, he wanted to separate the neighbors' cars and calculate the car of Gladys's future husband. While the debates were ongoing, the killer unexpectedly made a controversial decision. He decided to speak on his own behalf in front of the jury. This is what influenced the subsequent verdict. It is worth noting that in the practice of lawyers, such an act can be either a complete failure or a salvation for the accused. On October 16th, Augustine spoke in his own defense. The prosecution asked him to talk about the incident in the house. It was expected that he would exactly repeat the version of the lawyers, according to which he fell into a state of passion and lost control of himself. Instead, the criminal claimed that he felt calm when he saw his ex in a wedding dress. According to Augustine, Juan and Davis attacked him, but this argument had long been refuted after watching the video. At the same time, according to the defendant, he really fell out of reality at that moment and did not remember exactly how he fired the pistol. Fortunately for the prosecution, nothing he said corresponded to a state of passion. During this story, the criminal tried to demonstrate remorse and even cried, but after the interview, all this looked unconvincing. On February 1st, 2002, the victim's family was waiting for the final decision. After lengthy hearings, the jury retired to discuss the verdict. Augustin was found guilty of premeditated murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 30 years behind bars. Gladys was buried in her hometown of Tamboril in the Dominican Republic. The body was sent to her homeland a week after her death. The woman was given to the earth in a wedding dress. A year after Gladys's death, a Florida resident put on a wedding dress and ran a marathon. After that, she gave an interview and stated that it was done in memory of Gladys's death, as well as in the name of the fight against domestic violence. Several communities still hold brides' marches in all states every year. Unfortunately, this does not lead to a significant reduction in the severity of the problem. After the trials, Augustin refused to speak publicly and did not give any comments to reporters. It became known that from the very beginning of his imprisonment, he turned to the gospel and began to preach among criminals. At the same time, his lawyers continued to fight for mitigation of punishment. Several appeals were rejected. Augustin is still in prison and will be eligible for parole in 2029. So, this tragic story about the murder of Gladys Ricart on the eve of her wedding by her own ex-boyfriend Augustin Garcia is a vivid example of the horrific consequences that unhealthy obsession and inability to accept a breakup can lead to. Despite his apparent kindness and selflessness, Augustin turned out to be a cruel criminal who cold-bloodedly took the life of his son's mother in front of her relatives. From childhood, we take certain things for granted, not even thinking about their value. However, there are those who did not have such parental love and support. Amber Gibson, unfortunately, did not have the opportunity to feel the warmth of a family atmosphere in her short life. Despite being a good person, life treated her cruelly and unfairly. Amber Gibson was born into the family of Peter and Anne Marie Gibson. In addition to her, the family had an older son, Connor. The small family lived in a disadvantaged area of South Lanarkshire, Scotland. Although the mother and children suffered from such an environment, the Gibsons could not afford anything better and were forced to put up with these conditions. Unlike other family members, the father fit perfectly into this marginal environment. He loved to drink but hated to work, so the whole family barely made ends meet, existing on government assistance. The money was barely enough for the bare necessities. The life of the Gibson family could hardly be called carefree. Not only did the man not care about the fate of his family, but he also turned out to be a real domestic tyrant with a cruel character. The children grew up in an atmosphere of cruelty and constant fear from an early age. Fortunately, the daughter got less, but her older brother had been subjected to violence since early childhood. The greatest suffering fell to the lot of his wife, Anne Marie, whom the man regularly beat, not being ashamed of the presence of children. The woman said that this happened constantly, but she did not dare to fight back and protect herself and her children. In the end, unable to bear it, she turned to the police. The investigators took up the case and brought charges of cruel treatment against the man. During the investigation, Peter did not even try to hide his cruel nature. He continued to threaten his wife, so she seriously feared for her life. Fortunately, this circumstance played against the aggressor and became proof of his guilt in court. Peter was sent to prison not only for domestic violence, but also for numerous offenses and crimes committed by him from 2001 to 2008. All of them were distinguished by special cruelty. The man undoubtedly posed a serious threat to society. One of the most revealing crimes was an attack on a little boy whom Peter beat with his hands and feet, inflicting serious bodily injuries. At the same time, he could not explain the reason for his aggression. He simply could not control himself when he was angry and lashed out at the first person he saw, right? As it turned out, this was not the only such incident. In addition, it was proven that one day the man raped a woman. He attacked her, tied her up, and began to strangle her. The victim admitted that at some point she reconciled herself to the inevitability of death, but the inhumans suddenly stopped the abuse. For all these crimes, Peter received 10 years in prison. It is clear that against the background of such behavior of the father, the children could not grow up in a calm and happy atmosphere. They were brought up in an atmosphere of fear and cruelty. Connor got the worst of it, suffering from physical violence and moral pressure from early childhood. Fortunately, the situation changed in 2008, when the father was finally put behind bars. At that time, the older child turned 5 years old, and Amber was only 3. It seemed that finally the family would be able to breathe a sigh of relief. However, after her husband's arrest, the mother began to abuse alcohol and lost interest in the children. The Child Protection Services took Connor and Amber from the family and placed them under the care of foster parents, the couple Craig and Carol Niven. They sincerely sympathized with these unfortunate kids who were simply unlucky to be born into such a hostile, unhealthy environment created by their biological parents, Wamam. The Nivens had long dreamed of having children, but could not have them. The foster son and daughter became the best opportunity for them to show their parental love. However, not everyone shared their desire to take other people's children into their care. Connor and Amber's biological grandparents also claimed custody of their grandchildren. They were convinced that the Nivens were taking foster children only for the sake of financial assistance from the state. However, their objections did not prevent the couple from formalizing custody, and the children moved to live with them in Hamilton, Scotland. Amber was remembered by everyone as a sweet, kind girl. Despite her modest character, she was cheerful and full of life, and it seemed that her cruel father had not had time to ruin her disposition. Although the first years of Amber's life were full of suffering, she retained a bright soul, was smart, and developed beyond her years. The girl loved art and singing, which pleased her new family. Unfortunately, the same could not be said about her brother Connor. The violence he experienced at an early age left its mark on his personality. From an early age, he had behavioral problems. He was withdrawn and had difficulty getting along with peers at school. The boy was known for sudden outbursts of anger, during which he could attack anyone. In character, he increasingly became like his father. Most often, the victims of his aggression were girls. Despite his attractive appearance, Connor was quite a cruel young man and liked to make creepy jokes. Connor had a habit of joking about death, and his cruel jokes shocked those around him more than once. Because of this, classmates avoided him, considering him an unpleasant and dangerous type. But no one suspected that Connor was quite serious about killing children and animals. People thought he just had a weird, dark sense of humor. Against this background, the boy had almost no friends. The reason for this was not only his specific humor and difficult character. It turned out that he had been struggling with mental disorders for a long time, which scared everyone. The teenager actively used the internet, maintained pages on social networks where he wrote creepy things. In one of his posts during his school years, he described his ailments in detail. It was obvious that at that time he had difficulties with socialization and understood what he was facing. But the illness turned out to be stronger than Connor. He wrote that he suffered from bulimia, depression, anxiety, and attention deficit disorder. Of course, he also had problems with academic performance. Some teachers considered the young man to be mentally retarded. He showed no interest in learning at all and often skipped classes. Unfortunately, no one conducted any tests or analyses to confirm these suspicions. Therefore, Connor's exact diagnosis remained unknown. Being a teenager, he found himself alone with his age-related and mental problems. Connor complained that people did not accept him, paying attention only to external manifestations. In fact, he did not consider himself a bad person, but simply wanted to cope with the consequences of his father's tyranny. The boy was convinced that it was his father who was to blame for all these problems. Despite his desperate attempts to socialize, the young man could not find common ground even with his own sister, who was only a few years younger. The foster parents tried not to leave them alone, knowing that it could end in conflict and even a fight. The children were separated from an early age so that their meetings and contacts took place under the supervision of adults. But even under the control of elders, Connor picked on his sister at the slightest provocation, so the foster parents sent them to study at different schools so that they could not intersect in any way during breaks. In high school, Connor was transferred to specialized educational institutions for teenagers who suffer from social, emotional, and behavioral problems. Amber attended a regular school during this period. As they grew older, the children faced new challenges, and Connor had great difficulty with them. He could not find a girlfriend for quite obvious reasons. His aggression scared everyone away, and of course no girl wanted to build a relationship with him. This made him very angry, so attacks on his sister became systematic. He literally looked for a reason to get hooked and take out all his aggression on her. The situation in their relationship became so aggravated that at the age of 14, Amber could not be under the same roof with him, being afraid of her brother. The girl insisted, and she was sent to an orphanage. At the same time, Connor continued to live with his foster parents until he reached the age of 18. In 2020, he also moved out from them because he was tired of their guardianship and took part in a Hamilton project called Blue Triangle. The essence of the project was to provide a hostel for people who did not have their own housing. In fact, he began to live in a homeless shelter. During their separate living, Amber and Connor continued to see each other, but communication was quite tense. As before, they constantly had conflicts. But now that the brother and sister were at a distance from each other, it became a little easier. They had fewer reasons for quarrels. Unfortunately, this could not protect the heroine of the story from new cases of cruelty in her life. In June 2021, the girl was attacked by 20-year-old Jamie Stars and raped, for which he received 10 years in prison. Before that, he had been released from prison on bail, where he spent several months. Interestingly, he was also charged with another sexual assault on a woman. The guy was already under 2 articles. Nevertheless, he was released on bail, and Jamie attacked again, this time Amber. The girl received psychological trauma and took a long time to recover from the attack. She continued to maintain contact with relatives and friends who supported her. She was very upset about what happened. At the same time, her brother remained indifferent and uninterested. During this period, Amber desperately sought support, so she tried to get close to everyone she considered relatives, including Connor. On November 26, 2021, Amber told her friend that she was going to meet with her brother. The girl was excited because they had not communicated for a long time, and she hoped that he had changed. Amber sincerely believed that the old conflicts would be forgotten, and finally, they would be able to talk calmly as brother and sister. During this period, the girl was still in the orphanage unit. Connor himself applied to the management to organize their meeting. She was let go to communicate with a relative. It was assumed that she would spend several evening hours with him, after which she would return. Amber's friend tried to dissuade her from this idea because Connor had previously shown cruelty to her, but the girl still went to meet with her brother. Amber posted a selfie with Connor on her social media page, and in this photo, she looked happy. No one else received any news from her. Around midnight, Amber's brother returned to his hostel. He immediately went into one of the offices and turned to an employee. Later, Amber admitted that he scared her with his unkempt appearance and strange behavior. Connor seemed gloomy, looked disheveled, out of breath. His hands were dirty up to his wrists. The employee was worried and asked if everything was okay with Connor, but he ignored the question, instead asking to make a phone call. According to the guy, he had a quarrel with his sister and had to leave in a hurry, but now he had cooled down and wanted to make sure that she safely reached the orphanage. The young man did call there, but they said that she never came for the night. After that, the employees of the institution turned to the foster parents, but they also did not see Amber. Initially, the meeting of the brother and sister took place in the house of the foster parents. Then the teenagers went for a walk to discuss some issues in private. It was after a walk in Cadzo Glen Park that the brother and sister parted, and he went to the hostel. After that, a statement was filed with the police. The girl was declared missing. As it turned out, Amber did not have a boyfriend. She could not run away. All her things were left in the hostel, so the police had suspicions that something bad had happened to her. Meanwhile, Connor seemed extremely indifferent. Despite the fact that his sister had disappeared, he did not even contact his foster parents to share his experiences. The young man made absolutely no effort to find out about his sister's fate. He just sat and waited. During this period, the police had already begun a search, and it was necessary to obtain at least some leads. It was logical to turn to the person who had last contacted Amber. Of course, the investigators came to Connor, who confirmed that they had walked together in the evening. However, according to him, as always, a dispute began between them. They quarreled, after which Connor left, leaving his sister in tears in the park. Then, the young man said that he wandered around the outskirts for a long time before getting to his hostel. Connor admitted that he knew these places poorly, which sounded very strange, because he literally grew up here. However, he insisted that he got lost, and even fell into a ditch in the dark, which is why Connor was so dirty when he turned to make a call. The young man's words immediately aroused suspicion among the detectives. He was able to easily point on the map where he met his sister, where they spent time in the park, and in what place he left her. However, he suddenly became confused when asked approximately where the ditch was located. The investigators tried to find out who Connor was with at that time, who could confirm his words. But the guy did not want to answer these questions. He was confused and tried to evade answers. The police failed to get anything out of him. In the end, he was simply released, and the investigation into the disappearance continued. 2 days had passed since Amber's disappearance. On November 28th, around 10:15 in the morning, a 45-year-old man named Stephen Corrigan contacted the rescue service. He said that while walking in Cadzo Glen Park, he stumbled upon the body of a girl, but according to his own confession, he did not immediately contact the emergency services. Stephen told a creepy story about how he first raped the body and only then called the police. According to him, he felt remorse about this and decided to confess. When investigators arrived at the scene, which was 200 meters from the bridge where Amber was last seen, they immediately began to check the suspicious man's words. The body was in a terrible condition. The victim was severely beaten, naked, and clearly raped. Later, forensic experts confirmed that Stephen's DNA was indeed found on almost all parts of the deceased's body, including intimate ones. Corrigan reported that upon seeing the body, he dragged it away from the road. So that no one would notice him, he did his dirty deed and covered it with branches. It was here that the body was found by detectives. At that time, he became the main suspect not only in the rape, but also in the murder of the teenager. After the forensic medical examination, it was possible to identify the body. The deceased, as expected, turned out to be 16-year-old Amber Gibson. This news came as a real blow to everyone who knew her. When Connor found out what had happened, he posted a farewell post on his social media pages dedicated to his beloved sister. He regretted that Amber had left so early and was saddened by the fact that no one else would know what a wonderful person his sister was. Local residents, upon learning about the creepy find, were very frightened. People brought flowers to the park where the body was found. No one could imagine what had happened to her, and most importantly, who could have done this to young Amber. Around the same time, Connor contacted the local newspaper. He wanted to give an interview to talk about his sister. The young man called her a beautiful person, and wanted people to know who this girl with a tragic fate really was. The local journalist scheduled a meeting time for December 2nd. He appeared in a small cafe, but Connor was never seen there. This is because at that time he was already arrested on suspicion of murdering Amber. When the body was on the forensic expert's table, the specialist immediately found 8 bruises on the girl's neck that corresponded to the picture of manual strangulation. In addition, she received several blows to the head with a blunt object, which led to a serious traumatic brain injury. A hematoma was found in the brain caused by prolonged beating. In addition, the deceased had a disfigured face, a broken nose, which means she was brutally beaten. Due to the inhumanity of the attack, it was assumed that the killer had a personal motive. According to the forensic expert, Amber was first attacked, beaten, and after a blow to the head, the girl lost consciousness. But the cause of death was strangulation, which occurred after that. Near the body, the victim's clothes and underwear were found. They were badly torn, as if they were torn off in a rage during the rape. The body was heavily smeared with dirt with obvious signs of being dragged along the ground. The strangest thing was that Amber's death occurred 2 days before Stephen Corrigan contacted the police. At the time of death, the man had a confirmed alibi, which means that someone else was to blame for her death. Then Amber's brother still aroused serious suspicions with his strange behavior. Investigators knew about the guy's cruel character and constant conflicts with his sister. It turned out that Connor reported Amber's death on social media a few hours before the body was found. How could he have known about this? At that time, the teenager was still listed as missing. Moreover, the brother was the last one to see her alive. This aroused suspicion in the police, and they began to take a closer look at Connor and look for evidence to bring charges against him. The detectives managed to find footage from surveillance cameras, thanks to which the last moments of the girl's life began to clear up. She was walking with her brother, first through the city, then they walked across the bridge near the park. A young couple appeared on camera recordings at 9:57 p.m. Just before that, at 9:51 p.m., Amber took a selfie with Connor and posted it on her social media page. In this image, she appeared happy. This suggested the meeting was going well, and they were likely heading towards the park where the body was later found. Approximately 1.5 hours later, the young man was seen returning alone, with no one else visible in the recordings. Connor was also tracked on cameras located on the facades of the dormitory where he lived. Before entering the building, he discarded part of his clothing in a trash container, which looked extremely suspicious. Police officers searched the containers and managed to find the jacket the young man had been wearing on the night of his sister's murder. Notably, he did not dispose of the rest of the clothes he had been wearing at that time. Traces of dirt and blood were found on the young man's jacket, as well as on his shoes. After forensic analysis, it was proven that the blood belonged to Amber, implicating him in the attack on his sister. In reality, Connor did not dispose of most of his clothes and shoes because he simply didn't have spare items. The young man couldn't afford new shoes and clothes. Otherwise, as the detectives were certain, he would have thrown them in the trash without hesitation. Instead, the suspect wiped them clean of dirt and blood, but not very thoroughly, which played into the hands of the police. They were able to detect traces of DNA. All of these belonged to his sister. Blood was also found on Amber's underwear. Analysis showed that it did not belong to her. The traces, as it turned out, belonged to Connor. He likely injured his hand when the girl was struggling. Additionally, Connor's bodily fluids were found on her body, indicating he had assaulted her. Now investigators could directly link him to the committed crime. Detectives checked the young man's mobile phone. It turned out that the day after the murder, around noon, he sent a message to a messenger group. There were 5 people in it. Connor was asking everyone for help with the search. 40 seconds after this, he sent a message to his sister, asking if she was all right. Later, he wrote to the group again and said that help was not needed and it was a bad joke. Then the suspect made search queries in his browser to find out how to avoid phone tracking, as well as how to protect data if the police were to check it. He was clearly trying to learn how to cover up the crime more effectively and not get caught. During the inspection of his mobile phone, another unpleasant side of the brother and sister's relationship was revealed. Judging by Ember's correspondence, he had previously assaulted her and threatened retaliation if she told their adoptive parents or the police. This became one of the reasons why the girl wanted so badly to move out of her foster family's home at 14 years old. Ember kept silent about this event due to threats from her brother, or perhaps she loved him too much to turn him in to the police. But it seems that shortly before her death, the girl decided to tell her adoptive parents about it, and this could well have become a motive for murder. The investigation reconstructed an approximate picture of the events of that bloody night. Presumably, Connor met with his sister, and they did indeed go for a walk, hoping to mend their relationship. The recordings showed them calmly communicating. Everything seemed quite normal. Then they wandered into the park, where the conflict began. Most likely it was provoked by the young man, and it happened spontaneously. On the other hand, it was not ruled out that what happened was planned by the perpetrator in advance. Perhaps the brother intentionally invited her to meet, led her to a deserted place to attack, assault, and kill his sister. Either way, Connor carried out his intentions towards Ember. As a result, the girl died from strangulation by hand. The young man left the body in the same park, and when he dragged it to another location, he left it literally on the footpath. On December 2nd, 2021, 18-year-old Connor Gibson was arrested, never having met with the journalist, in an attempt to create an image of a grieving brother. He was charged with the murder and assault of his own sister. Despite all the evidence of his involvement, Connor continued to deny guilt in the crime. But the police had too much direct evidence against the young man, so his guilt was beyond doubt to anyone. Ember's blood was found on his clothes and shoes, and his DNA traces remained on her body and underwear. He was recorded on cameras near the crime scene and had no alibi. The police also relied on data from the suspect's mobile phone when he made specific queries. He never managed to find the right website that would advise him on how to hide his data. After Connor's arrest, his adoptive parents repeatedly made statements against him. The problem of social adaptation, how communication was built with other students at school, acquaintances in the homeless shelter, always caused great concern for those close to him. Connor had very dark interests, and his relationship with his sister never seemed loving or warm. The correspondence between them about previous incidents of assault was also used against him. After news of Ember's death arrived, Connor did not appear concerned or upset. It seemed he was simply indifferent to this fact. Obviously, the young man thought his attempts to deceive the investigation would be effective. This clearly indicated a low level of intelligence and could be a reference to mental health issues that distorted reality for the young man. According to the foster parents, they also couldn't contact Connor during these days until Ember's body was discovered. He showed no interest in the search operation, despite the concern of everyone around him. This case caused significant public resonance. All the townspeople were in shock, given all the gruesome details and such a strange coincidence where the victim suffered violence from two people at once. Upon learning the whole truth about this, the public simply didn't know what to think. It turns out that before this incident, two dangerous monsters who craved blood and could attack at any moment were roaming free. Now justice awaited them. In reality, the amount of evidence against Connor allowed for such a solid foundation for the prosecution that the defense attorney had literally nothing to refute. The defense unsuccessfully tried to prove that investigators didn't show CCTV footage that would have captured Connor's direct attack on the girl. They believed that the brother did indeed go for a walk with her, but didn't try to harm her. However, the lawyer couldn't explain the killer's DNA traces on the girl's underwear and body. Any argument sounded simply unconvincing. Unfortunately, there were no surveillance cameras in that deserted crime scene, so the moment of the attack wasn't recorded. Nevertheless, there was more than enough evidence of his guilt. The trial lasted 13 days, after which the jury went to deliberate on the verdict. The jurors unanimously found Connor Gibson guilty of murdering and assaulting his 16-year-old sister. He received a life sentence. Despite the brutality, he was given the right to apply for parole after 22 years of imprisonment. After this, it was time for 45-year-old Stephen Corrigan, who confessed to assaulting Ember Gibson's dead body after discovering her on the park path. During the trial, the man couldn't really explain why he did this when he found the murdered body. According to him, the defendant couldn't resist and pounced on the victim with the intent to assault her. In fact, the prosecution long doubted what specific charge to bring against the man. Eventually, he stood trial for obstructing justice. His DNA samples were found on 39 different areas of the deceased's body, which indeed complicated the investigation. The defense referred to Stephen's father, 79-year-old William Corrigan. The man claimed that his son Stephen was a decent person and couldn't have abused the girl's body. He simply refused to believe it. According to the father, shortly before this, Stephen was in the family's shared house, behaving calmly and not being aggressive. Moreover, not long before the incident, he fell and severely injured his hand. The father believed that in such a condition, Stephen couldn't have done anything to the girl's body, no matter how much he wanted to. However, he couldn't explain the numerous DNA samples of his son found all over the murdered girl's body. Obviously, during his walk, Stephen shouldn't have had any contact with the victim's body, but one way or another, it occurred. He wasn't acquainted with Ember, and his DNA appeared on the body after her death. Stephen's ex-wife testified in court, claiming that the man was prone to violence. According to her, Stephen had attacked her, beat her, and she feared for her life. Therefore, the woman wasn't surprised that he was involved in the crime. The defendant's lawyer was still trying to find a reasonable version of what happened to mitigate his client's guilt. The defense attorney claimed that Stephen found the body and moved it into the bushes so that no one else would stumble upon the gruesome discovery. Supposedly, the defendant took care of the victim and other passers-by in this way. After this, he immediately contacted the police and reported finding the body. The lawyer called his confession of necrophilia an ill-conceived joke. In any case, moving the body wouldn't require leaving traces all over the deceased's body, including intimate areas, as well as leaving male fluids. This clearly happened for another reason. Stephen was also found guilty of the charges brought against him and sentenced to 9 years in prison. The most shocking aspect of the crime to everyone was that the girl was betrayed by her own family member. From childhood, they had faced their father's cruelty and mother's indifference, but this didn't bring them closer together, so later, the children spent a significant amount of time in foster care and orphanages and were separated from each other due to Connor's aggression. Ember always hoped to mend their relationship, despite warnings from friends and violence on his part. She went to this meeting to give him a chance, but, as it turned out, she was walking towards her death. However, Connor wasn't moved even by these painful speeches. Throughout the entire trial, he behaved completely indifferently and showed no emotions. Of course, the killer's mental state raised significant questions. He clearly had mental disorders that played a key role in this crime. He grew up in an aggressively unhealthy environment and was older than Ember, so he had remembered their father's cruelty, which the whole family suffered from, much better. The lawyer insisted that the young man had been asking for help for a long time, as evidenced by his social media posts where Connor talked about his problems and how he was trying to cope with them. Unfortunately, no one ever heard him. Ember's biological grandparents, who had never managed to gain custody of the children in their time, blamed the foster parents for the tragedy that occurred. In their opinion, they weren't directly guilty, but indirectly guilty because they didn't pay proper attention to the troubled brother and sister. The relatives continued to insist that the only reason they adopted the children was for state assistance. As soon as the foster parents received the money, they immediately showed indifference to the new family members. The grandparents also claimed that all the children of this couple were in similar danger. As it turned out, Ember and Connor weren't their only foster children. The foster parents denied such allegations. They assured that they tried their best to support the troubled children, but it was very difficult. In particular, for their own safety, it was decided to send Ember to an orphanage to keep her away from her brother. When Regina Krieger's father entered his 14-year-old daughter's room on the morning of February 28, 1995, he hoped to find her there. But instead of the girl, the man stumbled upon a bedroom soaked in blood. The teenager's body could not be found for a long time, and when it finally got into the hands of forensic experts, the specialists were struck by the inhuman cruelty and the all-consuming horror the Regina had experienced before her death. These chilling events took place in the town of Twin Falls, Idaho, USA. In 1995, the population of this city barely reached 32,000 residents. Now, it has doubled. Twin Falls is a small, tidy, and welcoming town that seems like an ideal place for a peaceful life and raising children. But even in such quiet corners, monsters in human form sometimes hide. Regina Krieger was born on March 3, 1980, to the family of Rhonda Freeman and Daniel Krieger. The Regina always shone with a smile, had many friends, and a younger brother named Clifton. Regina loved music and water skiing, so she was a member of a youth ski club based at Myrtle Lake. In addition, she was a believer and attended a youth group at the Lutheran Church. However, with the approach of adolescence, unfortunate changes began in Regina's life. In June 1994, her parents divorced. The child experienced their separation very hard, and the situation was further complicated by the division of property, which the former spouses could not agree on. In September of the same year, Regina spoke in favor of living with her father. The mother was against it, but having plunged into disputes about the division of jointly acquired property, she decided not to aggravate the situation and agreed to give her daughter to Daniel. From then on, the Regina continued to live with her dad in a more or less calm atmosphere, but already from December 1994, serious changes began to happen to her. Regina began to behave differently, her habits and appearance changed, and in January 1995, she got involved with a bad company at Burley Middle School, where she was in the 9th grade. The parents saw that something was wrong, but could not get the truth out of their daughter. Their relationship gradually deteriorated, until the girl finally decided to stop communicating with her dubious friends. Regina was provided with support in the form of a psychologist consultant who was supposed to help her cope with the problems that arose due to her parents' divorce. A trusting relationship developed between them, and this really became a good support for young Regina. Later, she confessed to the psychologist that she was going to drop out of school. The girl explained this decision by poor academic performance and regular truancy. She came to this decision after receiving a letter from the school with a warning about possible expulsion if she exceeded the limit of absences. However, soon Regina changed her mind and decided to catch up on her studies in order to keep her place in school. On February 27, 1995, the girl again stated that she wanted to quit school and go to work. But the psychologist managed to convince the school teachers that the teenager was going through difficult times. This gave Regina another chance. She was allowed to attend several classes from which there were to be exams. This would allow her to score the necessary points and not be held back for a second year. The girl decided to take advantage of this opportunity and still stay in school. That same day, she returned home after a difficult school day. Here, Regina lived with her father and brother, whose rooms were located on the second floor, and the girl's bedroom was in the basement. That evening, the family gathered together, had dinner, discussed some important matters, including studies, after which everyone went to rest around 11 o'clock. This evening became the last time Regina was seen alive. On the morning of February 28, 1995, the Regina's brother Clifton called for her, as the rest had long been up and his sister was nowhere to be found. She did not respond to his call, so the boy went down to her bedroom. There he saw traces of blood, but did not find Regina anywhere. The teenager ran to his father and told him what he had seen. He went downstairs and made sure that his son was telling the truth. The room was empty, and suspicious bloody stains could be seen on the floor. After that, the man called the 911 emergency service and also began to call all the relatives and friends of his daughter to find out where she was. The father hoped that the Regina, who had recently behaved like a difficult teenager, had simply run away to one of her friends and was hanging out with them. But his hopes were dashed when all of Regina's close friends rejected such a version. The police arrived at the scene fairly quickly, but the law enforcement officers were not too quick to perform their duties. Without much enthusiasm and attention, they examined the crime scene, took the bloody blanket, and a training sword for martial arts. The only thing the officers noted was that there were no signs of breaking or entering in the house. Therefore, in their opinion, the girl left the house voluntarily and could well have staged an attack on herself. The father denied such an assumption. Why would Regina stage an attack, splashing blood everywhere, just to run away? It did not make sense. The investigators pondered this and still believed the father, so they began an investigation. It should be noted that at that time there were no high-precision modern methods of human DNA analysis, and video surveillance cameras and other cutting-edge forensic techniques were not yet widespread. This significantly limited the detectives in their ability to evaluate evidence, which was already scarce. Meanwhile, checks and interrogations began. The first to come under suspicion, of course, were the missing girl's father and brother. They were subjected to a polygraph test, and both passed it without any problems. But the investigators did not cross the father off the list of suspects because they simply had no one else. Both the father and the brother stated that they were sound asleep and did not hear anything suspicious at night. At the moment, it was considered that Regina had simply disappeared. There was enough blood in her room to speak of a serious injury or active resistance on the part of the Regina. At the same time, there was too little of it to claim a lethal case. It was assumed that Regina could have run away, escaping from the attacker, or some villain had kidnapped her and she was still alive. However, the Regina must have been familiar with the perpetrator and opened the door for him herself. Otherwise, it is difficult to explain how he got into her room without breaking the front door or window. One of the important sources of information for the investigators was Regina's diary. In it, the girl described in detail the events from her life. Many pages were devoted to her parents' divorce and how bad she felt about it. The police also learned that Regina had a boyfriend named Isidro. She hid him from her relatives, but actively met with him lately. In the diary, he is described as a teenager of Latin American origin. According to the entries, he lived in Twin Falls, and his grandparents lived in Burley, not far from the Krieger family. Isidro allegedly drove a green pickup truck and was expelled from school. The police carefully studied this information and set about searching for the guy to find out more about Regina from him, but they could not find either the car or the parents or other relatives of Isidro or himself. It was assumed that the Regina invented this character against the background of psychological problems associated with her parents' divorce. Perhaps this was how she dealt with the emotional difficulties that befell her. Therefore, no one attached any particular importance to this information. The Krieger family reached a dead end. They completely lost hope and did not know what to do and how to continue the search. Of course, everyone hoped until the last moment that the Regina would be found alive, and they did not stop looking for her. Trying to get at least some information and come across new witnesses, the relatives printed about 30,000 flyers, which they distributed and pasted on the streets. On April 15, 1995, a badly decomposed female body was found nearby in the Snake River. This was 15 kilometers from the missing schoolgirl's house. Forensic experts determined that the remains belonged to a young girl, no older than 20 years. By April 17th, specialists were able to identify the body using dental records. It was indeed Regina Krieger. Several stab wounds were found on her body, including a slit throat. The girl died a terrible and agonizing death. After that, the case was reclassified from a missing person to a premeditated murder. The news spread like wildfire through the town, causing unprecedented outrage among the residents. People became extremely vigilant. Twin Falls is a small city, so the version of a possible serial maniac who breaks into houses and kills girls caused a real panic. The townspeople were afraid to leave their homes and began to lock their doors with all the bolts. After all, the appearance of a murderous psychopath posed a threat to every resident. The Krieger father was especially worried. The victim's younger brother was only 13 at the time, so he could be in danger. Despite the heightened public attention, the investigation did not budge. No information about suspicious persons or leads was received by the police. Later, the detectives became aware of some new circumstances. It turned out that when Regina got into a bad company, she met drug dealers. One of them was a man named Gilbert Flores Rodriguez. Investigators suspected that the motive for the girl's murder could be non-payment for drugs purchased from him, a large debt, or something similar. At the time of the investigation, Gilbert was 32 years old. He was officially unemployed but constantly shuttled between two cities, Burley and Twin Falls, dealing in the distribution of prohibited substances. It was known that the man belonged to one of the local gangs. In general, he was an extremely dangerous type with whom it was better not to get involved, and it was definitely not worth being in debt to him. At the same time, the drugs that Regina was buying were quite expensive, so it was difficult to even imagine what amount the girl owed. It could be hundreds of dollars, an unbearable sum for a 14-year-old teenager. But despite everything, there was no direct evidence against Gilbert at the moment. Later, calls from anonymous informants began to come to the police. They said that the drug dealer was clearly involved in the schoolgirl's murder, but as soon as the officers tried to find out who exactly was providing this information, the witnesses hung up the phone, fearing exposure. No one wanted to have problems with this criminal element. The anonymous messages did not contain specifics, so there was still a lack of evidence against Rodriguez. The investigators considered Gilbert only as a participant in criminal schemes related to drugs. In any case, the communication of a 32-year-old unemployed drug dealer man with 14-year-old teenagers looked more than suspicious. And the very fact of drug distribution among minors entailed a serious accusation. However, for law enforcement to bring charges, they needed more compelling evidence. The detectives continued to dig up information about Regina and her surroundings, and then their attention was drawn to one person. Among the deceased's friends from her problematic company, a certain Cody was found. He also bought drugs from Gilbert. As it turned out, on the night of the probable murder, Cody was also hanging out with the drug dealer. The boy was interrogated. He reported that his friend had lain unconscious in the bathtub all night. However, his testimony was extremely confusing. The teenager was very nervous and changed his story several times. It seemed that he was mortally afraid of something, hiding something, and not inclined to make contact. In the end, the police treated his words with extreme skepticism, and Rodriguez remained the main suspect in this case. Throughout 1996, officers actively hunted Gilbert. It turned out that the police had already detained him more than once before. This happened in 1991 and 1993. Investigators suspected that even then the man was involved in drug distribution, but could not catch him red-handed. Therefore, they had no grounds to bring a specific charge and put the criminal behind bars. To catch the cunning dealer, they decided to set a trap for him. The police detained a guy named Joe, who had previously bought drugs from Gilbert. They offered to forget about some nuances of his criminal past if he bought a batch of goods from the drug dealer. Then the cops could catch Rodriguez red-handed. Joe agreed and bought drugs worth $1,500. This allowed the police to arrest the dealer on November 18, 1996. But the real difficulties were just beginning. Because the cunning distributor was not going to jail and intended to fight for his freedom. There were many rumors about his crimes. People suspected Gilbert of being involved in the death of another person, a guy named Blake Morgan Jr. Well, of course, in the murder of the heroine of our story, Regina Krieger. These crimes really had common features. Blake was also killed in his own home in his sleep when the attackers broke in from the street. True, no one kidnapped him, unlike Regina. On April 10, 1996, during the investigation, it was possible to find out the names of Blake's killers. The police learned that he was attacked by the same Cody, who was one of Gilbert's clients and henchmen. The second turned out to be his half-brother Jesus. He simply blindly adored his criminal relative. For Jesus, Gilbert was a real role model whom he incredibly respected and unquestioningly carried out all his orders. And it was no coincidence because, as it turned out, Rodriguez replaced his father and prepared him to help in his criminal affairs. The reason for the attack on Blake was a drug debt. Although the guy himself did not even use them, the case was about a girl named Angela who was dating Gilbert at the time. She claimed that Blake had once offended her and even hit her, and Rodriguez decided to take revenge. All this led to Jesus putting a 9mm gun to Morgan's head. This happened on April 9, 1996, just 2 weeks before Regina's death. The evening before, a company of hooligans and Blake accidentally met in a bar. Gilbert immediately told his half-brother that he wanted him to kill their common enemy, who had behaved unworthily with his girlfriend. However, the villains decided to plan this crime more carefully, so they did not attack the guy in front of witnesses. Instead, they broke into his house at night, around 2:30. But they were forced to leave because they did not find anyone inside. This happened the next night after the meeting in the bar. But around 3:30, the criminals returned and caught their victims sleeping carelessly. Cody and Jesus kicked the door in, crept into the house, and together shot Blake in the head. It was obvious that it was Gilbert who was behind all these brutal crimes. But since he acted through the hands of others, remaining in the shadows, he could not be directly linked to the murders. Later, the whole trio of villains was still arrested and put behind bars. They were charged with the premeditated murder of Blake. But at that time, no one even considered them as suspects in the case of Regina Krieger. For some incomprehensible reason, law enforcement officers did not even try to compare these crimes. Investigators completely ignored the testimony of anonymous people who had previously contacted the police by phone. They did not believe the rumors about the similarity of the murders. While the dangerous drug dealer was awaiting sentencing in prison, the Iowa Drug Enforcement Administration was trying to establish the identities of the informants. During this period, Gilbert let slip to other prisoners that he himself would not mind finding out the names of these people. He said he had already dealt with 2 snitches and intended to do the same with the rest. On June 26, 1997, Rodriguez was officially sentenced to 30 years in prison, but after 10 years, he was released. For some completely incomprehensible reasons, the police suspended the investigation into Regina's case. The detectives never linked her death to the drug dealer, although all the threads led to him. For many years, folders with evidence and testimony were sent to gather dust on archival shelves. New progress in the investigation was achieved only thanks to Rodriguez's accomplice, the same Cody Thompson, who also hung out with the dealer. The guy kept his secret for a long time, which he finally revealed. And this allowed to put an end to the brutal murder of the schoolgirl once and for all. In 2013, a new investigator decided to resume work on this case. First of all, he reviewed all the evidence that his predecessors had previously collected. Examining the photos from the crime scene, the detective noticed a bloody trail that clearly indicated that the victim had been dragged down the stairs and carried out into the backyard. It is unclear how the former investigators did not notice this. The detective carefully evaluated all the witnesses, and he was most interested in Cody, who was serving a life sentence. Previously, he'd given confusing testimony about the night when Regina was kidnapped from her home. Having gone to prison as a teenager, Cody had already turned 40. His criminal track record included serious crimes: rape, burglary, aggravated escape during which he attacked a supervisor, as well as the murder of Blake. Finally, after more than 2 decades, the new law enforcement officer put together the facts that seemed obvious from the outside. The detective had no doubt that these criminals had killed Regina, but they all kept silent. Then the investigator contacted one of Cody's former cellmates, a lifer who went to prison in 2009. He had nothing to lose, so the police managed to persuade him to cooperate. Thanks to his testimony, it was possible to reconstruct the chain of events on that tragic night when the 14-year-old girl was brutally killed. Late in the evening of February 27, 1995, Regina went to bed after 11 o'clock, as did the rest of her family. Everyone fell fast asleep, not expecting that something terrible would happen that night. Meanwhile, Gilbert and Cody were aimlessly driving around the neighborhood in a car. Suddenly, the drug dealer remembered that he had one unfinished business and needed to stop near the nearest house. Rodriguez parked the car in an alley near the Krieger's house. Cody stayed in the car and watched as his friend made his way through the bushes, jumped over the fence, and disappeared into the house through the back door. Thompson sat in the car, watching what was happening. After some time, Gilbert appeared again. He called the guy, and he got out of the car. The drug dealer said that everything had not gone according to plan, and he had made a mess. So he asked Cody for help. After that, Rodriguez returned to the house and then headed for the car with something heavy wrapped in a bloody blanket. That something looked like a human body. Cody helped load the girl's corpse into the trunk, but still could not get the murderer to tell him what had happened. The criminals drove away. But soon Gilbert buried the knife with which he had stabbed the victim somewhere. Then both of them went to a party, where Rodriguez hung out without any remorse in a shirt stained with blood. Probably, it was the participants of that party who called the police and shared their suspicions about him. Then the villains went to their mutual friend, where they changed clothes and washed off the blood. And then they drove about 15 kilometers to a bridge over the Snake River. At this moment, Cody began to panic, so Gilbert put a gun to his temple and ordered him to throw the body into the river from the bridge. The juvenile criminal obeyed. Then he went home and barricaded himself in his room. Cody screamed in his sleep and behaved extremely nervously in general, which attracted the attention of his relatives. But the boy did not know whose corpse he had thrown into the water and was not going to tell about it. The fact is that he was terrified of Rodriguez, who threatened him with reprisals. Cody generally tried to forget about that night as if it were a nightmare. And only later, at school, he finally realized that it was Regina, the same girl who disappeared from her own home and whom everyone was looking for. Thompson panicked because, in fact, he could be considered an accomplice to the crime. So he kept silent. The teenager kept his mouth shut also because Gilbert threatened not only him, but his entire family. Later, the detectives talked to Cody, and he confirmed everything that his cellmate had told. Thanks to cooperation with the police, the boy was not charged in the case of Regina Krieger. However, by that time he was already serving a life sentence and had no chance of being released. On February 20th, 2019, drug dealer Gilbert Rodriguez, who was at large, was arrested and charged with the murder of Regina. But he refused to plead guilty. After that, new witnesses appeared who claimed to have seen the defendant at a party on the night of the girl's murder in bloody clothes. People said that he was covered in blood, although he himself had no wounds. In addition, several people noticed how he buried a knife nearby. And anonymous informants who had previously called with their suspicions also contacted the police. In October 2021, 58-year-old Gilbert Flores Rodriguez was found guilty of the premeditated murder of Regina Krieger. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the right to parole. It took 26 years to reach this verdict, but its announcement became a real relief for both the family of the deceased and for the whole town. People rejoiced that the dangerous criminal had finally ended up behind bars and would never be released again. So, this chilling story about the brutal murder of 14-year-old Regina Krieger has finally come to an end. The girl whose life was so tragically cut short in February 1995 has finally seen justice, even though it took a long 26 years. The ruthless drug dealer Gilbert Rodriguez, who cold-bloodedly took the life of the young beauty, will spend the rest of his days behind bars, and Regina's relatives can now breathe a little easier. After all, the monster who took away their beloved daughter, sister, granddaughter, has finally paid for his inhuman crime. This story has been a real test for the law enforcement system. Only the persistence and ingenuity of the new investigator were able to unravel this eerie tangle and bring the guilty to light, even if it was many years after the tragedy. But perhaps most of all, this case showed how costly inaction and negligence can be. If the first detectives had been more responsible in their investigation and had put all the facts together in time, Rodriguez could have ended up behind bars much earlier, and perhaps forever. Then Blake Morgan Jr., who was also killed by the drug dealer's henchmen, would have remained alive. This story teaches us that evil does not always hide in dark alleys and courtyards. Sometimes it lives next to us, walks the same streets, and wears a mask of decency. And that it is worth trusting your intuition when you see something suspicious. After all, your caring and a timely call to the police can save someone's life. If you were impressed by this story, subscribe to the channel. Here you will find many more eerie and fascinating real-life cases that will leave no one indifferent.